Clara drove the hammer down so hard, the nail split clean through the timber and bit into her palm. She didn't stop. Blood ran across her knuckles, dripped onto the raw wood and dried in the Montana sun before she reached for the next nail. 6 months pregnant alone on land that had no road, no well, no name, she swung that hammer again. Because if she stopped even for one breath, she was going to think about what he said the night he left. And she had decided she was never going to think about that again. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Every part of this will matter. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The first thing people in Harlan Creek said about Clara Whitfield was that she was going to die before October. The second thing they said was that she deserved it. They said it quietly, the way people do when they want the cruelty to land without the accountability. They said it over fence posts and across dry goods counters and in the back pews of a church that preached mercy on Sundays and practiced something entirely different the other 6 days of the week. They said it with the particular satisfaction of people who had decided a woman's suffering was proof of her own bad choices rather than proof of theirs. Clara knew what they were saying. She had ears. She had eyes. She had walked through that town twice in the first week after she arrived, once to buy what little her money could stretch to cover, and once to register her claim at the land office. And both times she had felt the weight of those stairs pressing into her back, like a flat iron held just a second too long against skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't hurry. She bought her nails and her rope and her sack of cornmeal, she said good morning to the woman behind the counter, who did not say it back, and she walked out of that store with her head at the exact same angle it had been when she walked in. But that night, sitting beside the small fire she'd built in the open air, because the cabin had no roof yet, with the Montana dark coming down around her like something solid, Clara pressed one hand against the curve of her belly and talked to her daughter. She did this every night. Not because she was sentimental, because she had decided that this child was going to be born into a world where she already knew her mother's voice, steady, certain, unafraid. Even on the nights Clara didn't feel any of those things, she made her voice sound like she did. Because a child deserves to enter this world already knowing what courage sounds like. They think we won't make it, Clara said. I want you to remember that. Not to be angry about it, just to remember it. Because someday when you've made something that matters, it'll help you to know exactly who was watching and expecting you to fail. The fire popped. An owl called once from somewhere in the dark timber above her. Clara looked up at the skeleton of walls she'd been raising for 3 weeks. Rough-cut timber notched and fitted by hand, standing maybe 8 feet at the highest point where she'd managed to get the corner posts in. The south wall was the strongest. She'd taken the most time with it because it faced the wind, and she understood even then that what faced the most punishment needed the most preparation. She wasn't a carpenter. She had never claimed to be. What she was a woman who had spent 31 years watching other people build things, houses, reputations, futures, and had spent the last 4 of those years watching a man systematically dismantle everything she tried to build for herself. So when she found herself alone in the Montana high country in the summer of 1884, with a child growing inside her and a piece of raw land that nobody else wanted, she decided she was going to learn. She had bought one book, a building manual, old and water-stained, that she'd found in a box of discarded things outside the general store in Billings, 2 days before she reached Harlan Creek. She had read it 3 times on the wagon ride out. She had memorized the load-bearing principles, the foundation depth requirements, the roof pitch calculations for a region that saw heavy snow. She made mistakes. She made them constantly. She reset 2 corner posts after realizing she'd miscalculated the level. She tore out a section of the east wall and rebuilt it when the timber she'd used was green and already starting to bow. She dropped a beam on her foot in the 2nd week and bit down so hard on her own sleeve to keep from crying out loud that she left tooth marks in the fabric. But every morning she got back up. Every morning she lifted the hammer again. And every morning the walls stood a little taller. What the people of Harlan Creek didn't know, what they would never have been curious enough to ask, was where Clara had come from. Not the geography of it. They knew she'd come out of Billings. They knew she'd filed a homestead claim on 40 acres of rough ground at the eastern edge of the Calhoun Valley land that abutted the Carter Ranch on its north boundary, and had been sitting unclaimed because the creek access was complicated and the timber was dense, and most people who looked at it saw problem before they saw potential. What they didn't know was who Clara had been before she arrived. She had been the wife of Edward Whitmore for 4 years. She had been for those 4 years the most invisible visible woman in Helena. Edward Whitmore was not the kind of man who yelled. He was the kind of man who corrected. He was the kind of man who explained in a patient, quiet voice exactly what you had done wrong, exactly how it reflected on both of you, and exactly what you needed to do differently. He was the kind of man who attended church and tipped generously and shook every hand in every room and remembered every name, so that when his wife came to him privately with a bruise on her pride and a wound she couldn't point to directly, the people she might have told already loved him too well to believe her. She had not been beaten. She wanted to be clear about that to herself in the dark beside that Montana fire where there was no one to perform clarity for. Edward Whitmore had never raised a hand to her. What he had done was quieter and more complete. He had taken every decision, every preference, every small certainty she had about herself, and held it up to the light and found it wanting. Year by year, conversation by conversation, he had made her into something that agreed with him, something that waited, something that asked permission before it wanted things. And then she had gotten pregnant. She had expected she was not sure what she had expected. Something, some softening, some shift in the architecture of the man she'd married. She was carrying his child. Surely that meant she had given him something he could not diminish. Instead, Edward sat across the dinner table from her on a Tuesday evening in December of 1883, set down his fork with the particular deliberateness that meant he had something prepared, and told her that the timing was inconvenient, that he had business concerns that required him to be in Denver through the spring, that he had made arrangements with his sister in Butte, who could receive Clara for the confinement, and that when the child arrived, they would discuss the next steps at that point. He said it the way he said everything, reasonably, without heat. Clara sat across from him and felt something happen inside her that she didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't anger. It was more like recognition. The way you look at a thing you've been trying to make sense of for a long time, and suddenly you can see exactly what it is, and the clarity is both terrible and clarifying. She said, "I'm not going to Butte." Edward looked up from his fork. "Clara," he said, "I'm not going to your sister's house," she said. "I'm not going to wait in someone else's home for you to decide what the next steps are. I'm not going to do that." There was a pause. Edward set his fork down again, this time all the way. "You're being emotional," he said. "That's understandable given your condition." "I'm leaving," Clara said. She said it quietly. She said it the way he said things, without heat, because she had learned from 4 years of watching that the person who keeps their voice level in a conversation is the person who gets believed later. "You're not going anywhere," Edward said, and for the first time in 4 years, his voice dropped into something that wasn't reasonable anymore, something that was just the bedrock underneath the reasonable, and Clara heard it for exactly what it was. The sound of a man who had confused his wife's compliance with her consent for so long that he'd forgotten they were different things. She left the next morning before he woke up. She took the money from the household account. Not all of it, exactly half, because she had kept track for 4 years of every dollar she had brought into that marriage from her father's small estate, and she took exactly what was hers, and she took the clothes that fit her body as it was now, and she took the small tin box her mother had left her with the photograph inside, and she took nothing else. She did not take the life he'd built for her. That was his. She didn't want it. She went to Billings first because she knew no one there, and that was what she needed, a city where she was just a woman, not Edward Whitmore's wife, not a subject of careful correction and patient explanations. She found a boarding house. She found a land office. She spent 3 days going through the available homestead claims in the territory, looking for something nobody else wanted, something she could afford, something with timber and water access, even if the access was difficult. She found the 40 acres in the Calhoun Valley. She bought the building manual. She got in the wagon. And that was how Clara Whitfield, she had taken her mother's name back on the road to Billings quietly and without ceremony, because she was done with Whitmore, arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, in June of 1884, 6 months pregnant and entirely alone, to build something that was entirely hers. The land was harder than the manual had prepared her for. That was the first lesson. The manual was written by men who were imagining men, and it assumed a certain baseline of physical capacity that Clara was learning to work around rather than through. There were things she could not do at full-strength heavy lifts above her head, certain bracing techniques that required 2 people pressing from opposite sides. She found her way around each one. Sometimes it took her 3 times as long. Sometimes she had to wait until the morning when her body was less tired and approach the problem fresh. She did not ask for help. This was not stubbornness. She had thought about it carefully, and she had decided that asking for help from the people of Harlan Creek was not something she was willing to do because she already knew what the price would be. It would be a debt. It would be an obligation. It would be, however subtly, however slowly, another version of the same arrangement she'd just left. A man helped a woman. The woman owed the man something. The man had opinions about how she ought to proceed from there. She had lived inside that arrangement for 4 years, and she understood exactly how it worked, and she was finished with it. She hired a boy from town to haul timber twice, paid him. Fairly said nothing personal, sent him home both times, and everything else she did herself. By late July, the walls were at 6 feet on 3 sides, and she was working on the 4th. By early August, she'd solved the roof problem. It had kept her up 4 nights in a row, the roof problem. The pitch calculations weren't the difficulty. The difficulty was getting the ridge beam up alone. A ridge beam on a structure this size needed to go up 12 feet and sit level, and she didn't have the equipment, and she didn't have a second pair of hands, and she'd been lying on her bedroll, staring at the stars, working through every mechanical option she could imagine. And then on the 4th night, she sat up at 2 in the morning and said out loud to her daughter, "Gin poles." She built a set of simple gin poles from scrap timber the next morning. It took her a full day, and she tipped the first one wrong and had to reset it. But by evening of the following day, the ridge beam was up level within a 1/4 inch, and she was standing on the ground below it, with her hands on her hips and her back aching in 3 separate locations, and she was crying. Not from pain. From the sheer, almost physical reality of a thing she had built with no one's permission. It was the following week that the rider came. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of a horse coming through the timber with a certain carelessness. The kind of carelessness that belongs to a man who has never had to be quiet on land because he has always been on land that was his. Clara was on the half-built roof fitting boards when the horse and rider came out of the tree line at the lower edge of the property and stopped. She looked down. He was what this territory produced when it had the time and the money to produce something broad-shouldered, straight-backed, sitting the horse like it was an extension of his own body. He wore the dust of a long ride, and he wore it comfortably. His hat was pushed back from his face, and he was looking up at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not quite surprise, not quite anything else she had a name for. She looked back down at the board she was fitting and drove the nail. She heard him dismount. She heard the particular sound of a man composing himself, a small straightening, a breath taken differently. Then he said, "Ma'am." "State your business," Clara said. She did not look down again. She fitted the next board and reached for the nail. A pause. "My name is Nathaniel Carter. My family owns the—" "I know who the Carters are," Clara said. "State your business." Another pause longer. "This property shares a boundary with our north pasture. My father asked me to ride out and—" He stopped, started again. "There's been some concern about the construction, the proximity to our fence line." Clara drove the nail. "My claim is filed. My boundary is legal. Your fence line isn't my problem." "Yes, ma'am. I understand that. I just—" He stopped again. Clara set down her hammer and looked down at him. How was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe. The face of a man who'd spent considerable time outdoors, but who also, she suspected, spent considerable time indoors worrying about things. There was something around his eyes that suggested a mind that turned over problems at length, which she recognized because she had the same thing. "Mr. Carter," she said, "your father sent you out here expecting to find a situation he could manage. I'm not a situation. I'm a homesteader. I have legal claim to this property, and I intend to finish building my house on it, and I intend to live here. If your fence line has an issue with that, I suggest you move your fence line." His mouth did something. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "The fence line is fine," he said. "Then we don't have a problem." "No, ma'am." He looked at the half-built roof she was standing on. He looked at the walls. He looked at the gin pole rigging she hadn't taken down yet. He stood there for a long moment, not saying anything, and Clara watched him doing the arithmetic of what she'd built alone at 6 months along in 6 weeks. "That ridge beam went up straight," he said finally. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, the way a carpenter speaks to another carpenter. "Yes," Clara said. "It did." He stood there another moment. Then he put his hat back where it belonged and gathered his reins. "Good day, ma'am," he said. "Good day, Mr. Carter." He rode back into the timber. Clara went back to her boards. But she noticed and filed away without examining too closely that he'd ridden very slowly back through the tree line, like a man who wasn't quite ready to stop looking at something he didn't fully understand yet. He came back 4 days later. She was working on the floor joists when she heard him, and this time she was on the ground, so she saw him come out of the tree line, and she watched him ride toward her without breaking the rhythm of what she was doing, which was using a draw knife to true up the edge of a joist that had a slight bow in it. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance and dismounted. He was carrying something tied across his saddle. She could see it now, a bundle of some kind. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitfield." He walked toward her, and she saw that the bundle was lumber. Not rough timber-milled lumber, the kind you bought from the yard in town, the kind that came out straight and true and required considerably less labor than what she'd been working with. "I brought some my father had surplus from the barn repair. It would have been burned otherwise." Clara set down the draw knife. She looked at the lumber. She looked at him. "Your father had surplus lumber," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And he sent you to bring it here." A very brief pause. "That's right." "Mr. Carter," Clara said, "your father sent you here 4 days ago to convince me to leave. He didn't send you here with lumber." Something shifted in his face. Not embarrassment, more like the acknowledgement of a man who's been caught in a courtesy and isn't sure whether to defend it. "No," he said. "He didn't." "Then whose lumber is this?" He was quiet a moment. "Mine." Clara looked at him for a long time. "I will accept the lumber," she said finally, "under one condition." "Name it." "I work beside you. You don't build this house for me. You don't direct how it gets built. If you put your hands on this structure, it's because I've asked you to, and it's because we're working together on my terms. The moment that changes, the lumber goes back with you, and so do you." Nathaniel Carter stood in the afternoon sun on Clara Whitfield's land and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately catalogue. "Agreed," he said. They worked until the light failed that evening. He was, she discovered, genuinely useful, not in the way men were useful when they were trying to show you something, but in the way a person was useful when they paid attention and adapted to what was needed rather than what they'd assumed. When she needed a second pair of hands on a brace, he was there with the right pressure at the right moment. When she didn't need him, he found something else to work on without being told. They didn't talk much, not that day. But when the light finally went and Clara straightened and pressed a hand against the ache in her back, Nathaniel picked up his tools without being asked and stacked them with a neatness that suggested habit. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Clara looked at the structure. 3 walls fully boarded now, floor framed out, roof perhaps 4 days from done. 6 o'clock, she said. "I work from 6. "I'll be here at 5:30, he said. And before she could say anything to that, he was on his horse and gone into the dark timber, riding north toward the Carter Ranch, and Clara stood alone on the land that was hers and looked at what they had built that afternoon and felt something she was careful not to name yet, because she had learned that naming a thing too early gave it a weight it might not deserve. She pressed her hand against her belly instead. "He's interesting," she told her daughter. We'll see. The daughter kicked once, which Clara chose to interpret as agreement. He was there at 5:30. He brought coffee 1 cup, which he handed to her without preamble, and then went and found his own water from the creek while she drank it. She noticed that too. The particular consideration of a man who brings 1 coffee because it was for her and doesn't make a thing of what he doesn't have for himself. They worked 6 days straight. By the end of those 6 days, Clara had a roof. She stood under it in the early evening of the 6th day and looked up at the boards above her head. Her boards, her timber fitted by her hands and by the hands of a man who had, to his considerable credit, done exactly what he'd agreed to do, and not one thing more, and she breathed the particular smell of fresh-cut wood and Montana air, and something that was not quite pride, but was in the same family. "It's a good roof," Nathaniel said from behind her. "Yes," she said. "Going to need chinking on the north wall before cold weather." "I know. I've done that kind of work before." Clara turned and looked at him. "Are you asking?" she said. He held her gaze. "Yes, ma'am, I'm asking." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll let you know," she said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and they both understood the difference. He rode home. That evening, and Clara stood in her doorway. She had a doorway now and a door she'd hung herself. Though the latch was temporary, and she watched him go and tried to figure out what exactly she was dealing with. In her experience, men who helped women wanted something. That was not a cynical observation. That was just the pattern she had seen. Sometimes what they wanted was obvious and uncomplicated. Sometimes what they wanted was something they couldn't quite name themselves. The particular satisfaction of feeling necessary, of being the reason a problem got solved. Either way, the wanting was there. She hadn't found Nathaniel Carter's wanting yet. That made her careful. But she thought about the coffee. The single cup handed over without comment. The way he'd picked up tools at the end of a long day without being asked. The way he said, "Are you asking?" when she'd asked if he was asking the way he understood, without her having to explain it, that the asking mattered. She went inside and lit her lamp and started her dinner, and thought about a man who seemed to understand instinctively that what she needed was not someone to solve her problems, but someone to stand in the same weather she was standing in and not make her explain why she was still outside. He came back 3 days later to help with the chinking, because she'd told him she'd let him know, and she had. She'd sent word by the same timber-hauling boy she'd hired before a brief note. 2 sentences, "North Wall, Saturday, 6 o'clock, if it suits you." And he'd sent the boy back with a note of his own, equally brief, "It suits me." That was the day the town started talking. Word traveled fast in a county the size of Harlan Creek's. There was nothing to do with winter coming, and the harvest already in, except notice things, and what the town noticed was that Nathaniel Carter, oldest son of James Carter, heir to the largest cattle operation in the county, a man who had been informally understood for years to be intended for Margaret Holloway, whose family owned the mill, and whose combination with the Carter land would make a practical empire, had been seen riding north regularly for 2 weeks toward the unclaimed land where that woman was building. Clara heard it from the dry goods woman, who had apparently decided that delivering unasked-for information was an acceptable substitute for basic courtesy. "People are talking," the woman said, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering a warning they are secretly glad about. "About what?" Clara said, though she knew. "About you and Nathaniel Carter." "We're building a house," Clara said. "People say." "I don't reckon what people say concerns me much," Clara said pleasantly, and put her money on the counter and took her goods and left. But she thought about it on the ride back, sitting in the wagon with her boots on the footboard, and the Montana sky doing that thing it did in late August, where it turned a color that didn't quite have a name, too blue to be purple, too deep to be just blue. She thought about what it cost a man like Nathaniel Carter to ride out to a pregnant woman's homestead for 2 weeks in a town the size of Harlan Creek. She thought about what it said about him that he'd done it anyway. And she thought about what it would cost her if she started to trust that. The next time he came, she watched him more carefully. She was trying to find the angle. The thing he was getting out of this. Not because she was suspicious of him specifically, but because she had learned at considerable personal cost that understanding what a person wanted was the beginning of understanding who they were. He worked hard. He didn't take shortcuts. When he found a section of chinking that needed to come out and be redone, he said so clearly, without softening it, and without assuming she needed softening. "This section here," he said and pointed. "It looked fine, but the mortar didn't set right. It'll let in water if we leave it." "I'll take it out," Clara said. "I'll take it out," she said again, and he handed her the tool and stepped back and let her. She took it out. He handed her the materials for the redo. They worked it together. At noon, she fed them both from the pot she kept going on the small stove she'd installed inside. She hadn't planned to. She'd just made enough for two without thinking about it, which was the kind of thing she noticed in herself with suspicion. They sat outside the cabin in the brief warmth of the September noon, with the bowls in their hands and the timber around them holding that particular mountain quiet. "Why are you here?" she said. She meant it directly. She was past the point of asking things sideways. Nathaniel looked at the bowl in his hands. Then he looked at her. "Honest answer," he said. "Is there another kind worth giving?" I was quiet for a moment. "When I rode out here the first time," he said, "my father's exact words were, 'Go out there and talk sense to that woman before she builds something that creates a problem for us.' He thought you were he expected." He stopped. "I expected someone different," Clara said. "Yes." He looked in the wall in front of them. "And then I saw that ridge beam." He paused. "I've been doing ranch work my whole life. I've put up a lot of structures. That ridge beam the way you rigged those gin poles alone. I've seen men with 2 decades of experience and a full crew not do it cleaner than that." He glanced at her. "So I went back to my father and I told him you had a solid operation and there wasn't a problem with the fence line." "That's not why you came back," Clara said. "No," he said. "It isn't." "Then why?" He thought about it. "I reckon," he said slowly, "because most of my life I've been around people who have everything and act like they're owed more, and you—" He stopped. Tried again. "You have next to nothing, and you act like it's enough to work with." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't know people did that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Your family has plans for you," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard enough about the Carters to know the shape of those plans. "They do," he said, "and coming out here doesn't fit those plans." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked back at the cabin. Her cabin. The walls she'd raised, the roof she'd fitted, the structure that had gone up because she had refused to accept that she couldn't do it. "Then I reckon," she said, "you'd better figure out what you actually want, Mr. Carter, before your family figures it out for you." It was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon I better." They finished the chinking that afternoon. The north wall was solid. Clara ran her hand along the seam where the mortar had set and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done right, done properly, done in a way that would hold. Nathaniel cleaned his tools and loaded them onto his horse. "I'll be back Friday," he said. Clara looked at him. "There's still the window frames," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There are." He rode north. Clara stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched him go. And this time, she didn't stop herself from naming what she felt, because it was just a thing, and naming things honestly was how she'd always gotten herself to the truth of them. She was glad he was coming back Friday. She was also underneath that deeply and particularly afraid. Not of him. She wanted to be clear about that to herself, the way she was always clear with herself in the dark, where there was no one to perform clarity for. She wasn't afraid of Nathaniel Carter. She was afraid of needing someone. She was afraid of what happened when you needed someone, and they turned out to be underneath the coffee and the early mornings, and the careful way they handed you tools, without making you explain why you needed them, just another version of the thing she'd already left. She looked down at her hands. The calluses were thick now, the kind you only got from weeks of real work. She ran her thumb along the scar on her palm from the split nail at the very beginning, the morning she'd decided she was not going to stop even when she was bleeding. "We're going to be all right," she told her daughter. "Whatever happens next, we're going to be all right." Her daughter moved a long rolling movement, the kind that had started a few weeks ago, and felt like the child was reminding her she was there. Clara laughed once quietly in the empty doorway of the house she had built with her own hands. Then she went back inside and started thinking about window frames. He came back Friday. Clara heard the horse before she saw him. The same careless confidence in the hoofbeats that she'd learned to distinguish from deer moving through the lower timber, or the occasional lost cow from the Carter herd that wandered too close to the fence line. She was inside on her knees, fitting the last of the floorboards near the eastern wall when he tied up outside and knocked on the doorframe she'd hung 3 days ago. "It's open," she said without looking up. He came in, looked around once with that same careful arithmetic she'd noticed the first day, and said nothing about what he saw, which was a cabin that had become in the weeks since he'd first ridden onto this land a genuine home. Not a finished home, but a home. "Window frames," he said. "On the south wall first," Clara said. "The light comes in better from the south, and I need it for the winter." "Yes, ma'am." He picked up the lumber she'd pre-cut and carried it to the south wall and began measuring. Clara finished the board she was fitting and moved to the next one. They worked that way for an hour without speaking, and Clara decided that the silence between them had changed quality in the weeks they'd been working together. It wasn't the silence of two people who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of two people who were comfortable enough that they didn't need to fill the space between them with noise. She'd been careful about that. She noticed it, and she was careful about it, because comfort was exactly the kind of thing you let in before you understood what it was costing you. "Your father know you're here," she said. The sound of his measuring stopped for just a beat. Then it resumed. "He knows," Nathaniel said. And he's made his position clear." He set the square down. "He thinks I'm making a fool of myself." "Are you?" Clara said. He looked at her across the room. "I'm building window frames," he said. "I don't reckon that's foolish." "That's not what he means, and you know it." He was quiet a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." Clara fitted the board she was working on and moved to the next. "What exactly does he think is happening here, Mr. Carter?" "He thinks I've developed an inappropriate attachment to a woman of uncertain circumstances." "Uncertain circumstances," Clara repeated. She said it without heat, turning the phrase over like a stone to see what was underneath it. "That's a polite way to say it." "My father is a polite man," Nathaniel said. "When it suits him. And when it doesn't." He picked up his saw. "He told me if I keep coming out here, he's going to reconsider my position in the ranch operations." Clara's hands stopped. She looked at the board in front of her, and then she looked at him. "He threatened to cut you out," she said. "He suggested I reconsider my priorities." "Nathaniel." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it. She didn't take it back. "He threatened to cut you out. Say it plainly." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "That's what he did." "Then you should go," Clara said. She said it directly without hesitation, because she had made a rule for herself a long time ago that she would not be the reason another person lost something. She had already been someone's loss. She was not going to be that again. "I'm not going," he said. "Your father's operation is his," Nathaniel said. "I've spent 34 years doing exactly what my father's operation required. I've been engaged twice to women I didn't choose. I've sat at dinner tables with men I didn't respect, and shaken their hands and smiled because that was what was required." He set the saw down. He turned and faced her fully. "I am building window frames on a Friday morning because I want to be here. That is the first thing I have done in a very long time, purely because I wanted to, and I am not going to stop because my father is unhappy about it." Clara looked at him. She was thinking very carefully the way she always thought when she felt something pulling at her that she hadn't fully examined yet. "I'm not a romantic interest, Mr. Carter," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm a woman building a homestead who has accepted your help because you've earned my trust to a certain degree. That is the whole of what this is." "I know that," he said. "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am." He picked the saw back up. "But I'd like to keep coming anyway if you'll permit it. As a neighbor, that's all." Clara watched him for another moment. "South wall first," she said. "We're losing the morning light." He turned back to the wall, and they went back to work, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted the way things did when two people had said the true version of something out loud and couldn't put it back into the safer, vaguer form it had been in before. Clara thought about what he'd said 34 years doing what was required of him. She knew what that felt like. Not the money, not the land, not the particular weight of expectation that came from a family with the Carter name. But the feeling of living inside a shape that someone else had cut, and fitting yourself into it day after day until you forgot you weren't naturally that shape. She knew exactly what that felt like. The window frames went in that day and the next. By Sunday evening, the south window was fitted with glass. She'd bought it in Billings, wrapped it in her heaviest quilt for the wagon ride, and by some miracle, it had arrived unbroken, and the afternoon light came through it and hit the new floorboards in a way that made the inside of the cabin look like a painting. Clara stood in the middle of it and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of satisfaction, which was about as long as she ever allowed herself such things. Then she started thinking about the winter insulation. Nathaniel had gone home for Sunday, but he'd left some of his tools which she'd noticed and had decided to take as information rather than comment on directly. He wasn't ready to stop coming. He was telling her that by leaving things behind. She'd straightened his tools into the corner she'd designated and gone to bed. Monday morning she heard horses. Not one horses. Multiple coming through the timber faster than Nathaniel ever rode, with a weight and a purpose that told her before she could see them that this was not a social call. She was outside before they cleared the tree line. 3 riders. James Carter in the front. She knew him by description, and the description had been accurate. A big man who carried his age like it was armor rather than erosion, with a face that had the particular set of a man who had always won by making other people feel small before the negotiation even started. 2 ranch hands flanking him. James Carter pulled up his horse 20 feet from where she was standing and looked at her. She looked back. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was exactly what she'd expected. Reasonable. The kind of reasonable that had teeth in it. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you're on my property. I'm aware of that." He looked at the cabin. He looked at the gin pole rigging still standing at the east end. He looked at the lumber stacked against the south wall. And she watched him do the arithmetic, the same arithmetic his son had done, and she watched it land differently, not with the quiet recognition Nathaniel had shown, but with something more like recalibration. He was adjusting what he'd expected to find. "You've been building," he said. "I have," she said. "My son has been helping you." "Your son and I have been working together," she said. "There's a difference." James Carter looked at her for a long moment. He was trying to find the angle she recognized. He was trying to find the version of this conversation where he had control of it. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I'll speak plainly." "I'd be grateful if you would," she said. "My son has responsibilities. He has a position in this family and in this county that requires him to conduct himself with a certain propriety. His association with your situation." "My situation," Clara said, "is causing comment. It is drawing attention that reflects poorly on the Carter name and on Nathaniel's prospects." He leaned forward slightly on his horse. "I'm asking you, as a reasonable woman, to release him from whatever obligation he feels toward you and allow him to focus on his proper concerns." Clara stood in the September sun on the land that was hers and let James Carter finish. Then she said, "Your son comes here because he chooses to. He's a grown man. I don't hold him here. I don't ask him to come. He comes and he works and he goes home when he's done. If you want him to stop, you'll need to have that conversation with him, not with me." "I've had that conversation," James Carter said, and there was something underneath the reasonable now, the same bedrock thing she thought that she'd heard in Edward's voice on the last night in Helena. The sound of a man who'd confused people's accommodation with their agreement. "Then apparently he's made his choice," Clara said. "Is there something else I can help you with, Mr. Carter?" His jaw tightened slightly. "You're not making this easy." "I'm not in the business of making things easy," Clara said. "I'm in the business of building a homestead. Good day, sir." She turned and walked back to the cabin. She did not look back. She heard him sitting there on his horse for a long moment. She could feel it, the way you could feel someone staring at the back of your head. Then she heard him say something low to the two men with him, and the three horses turned and went back through the timber the way they'd come. Clara went inside and sat down on the floor of her cabin for precisely 2 minutes. Then she got up and went back to work. She did not tell Nathaniel about his father's visit. She made that decision deliberately and held it carefully, examining it from every angle to make sure she wasn't making it for the wrong reason. She wasn't protecting him from it because she thought he couldn't handle it. She was not telling him because she didn't want him to feel responsible for a conflict she hadn't invited and didn't require him to resolve. If James Carter wanted a fight with his son, that was between the Carters. She was not going to be the occasion for it. Nathaniel came Tuesday morning, and she said nothing about it, and they worked the east window into place, and then started on the interior partition wall she'd designed to give the sleeping area some separation from the main room. I was good with the partition framing faster than her, and she said so, and he said the Carter bunkhouse had been built with interior partitions, and he'd helped with the renovation 3 years back. How many people on the Carter operation? She asked. Not because she needed to know, because she was starting to understand that asking him questions was one of the few ways she could give him something, and she was trying to be careful about what and how much and why. 30 hands in the summer, he said. About 18 through the winter, plus my father, my mother, my younger sister, and... He paused. And myself. You live in the main house. I do. Do you want to? He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he laughed, a real laugh, not the polite version, the kind that came up from somewhere genuine. Nobody's ever asked me that. It's a reasonable question. No, he said. I don't. I'd rather have something smaller, something I'd built myself. He looked at the wall in front of him. But that's not how it works when you're a Carter. Why not? Because everything you do reflects on the family. Because the house you live in, the woman you marry, the way you spend your time. All of it's part of the operation. You're not a person exactly. You're a piece of the Carter ranch, and pieces of the Carter ranch don't go off and build their own things and live how they want. Clara measured a length of board. That sounds, she said, very much like a marriage I once had. He looked at her. Does it? He said quietly. Yes. She made her mark. A man decided what my life was for. He decided what I was worth, and what I wasn't, what was appropriate, and what was an embarrassment, and when I started taking up more space than he'd allocated for me. She picked up the saw. He reminded me that I was a piece of something, not a person. The silence held for a moment. Edward Whitmore, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. He'd heard the name from someone. She didn't blame him for knowing it. Harlan Creek was not a large place. Yes, she said. He's looking for you, Nathaniel said. Clara's hands stilled. She set the saw down very carefully. She turned and looked at him. Tell me, she said. He met her eyes. I heard it from the county clerk 2 weeks ago. Someone came asking about homestead claims in the Calhoun Valley. Asked specifically about a woman filing a loan. 2 weeks ago, she said. I didn't know whether to say anything. And now I'm saying it. He held her gaze. I'm sorry I waited. Clara stood for a moment in the frame of the partition wall she was building and let that information settle into her. She'd known somewhere in the back of her mind that Edward would not simply accept her absence. Edward didn't accept things he hadn't decided. Edward came and retrieved what he believed belonged to him. He'll claim the child, she said. Not frantically, just naming it the way she named things that needed to be looked at directly. What grounds does he have? Whatever he decides to manufacture, she said. He's a wealthy businessman with connections to half the judges in Helena. He'll say, I abandoned the marriage. He'll say I'm unfit. He'll say... She stopped herself. It doesn't matter what he'll say. What matters is that he'll say it loudly, and he'll say it to people who already want to believe the worst about a woman building alone. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she recognized now, the one where he was doing the same kind of thinking she did, turning a problem over to find its structure. What do you need? He said. A lawyer, Clara said immediately. Not your family's lawyer. Someone who doesn't owe the Carters anything. There's a man in Billings, Samuel Reardon. He's handled land disputes, he's independent. He won't be cheap. I have money, Clara said. Not much, but enough for a lawyer if I know what I'm fighting. I can find out more, Nathaniel said. About who came asking what exactly they were looking for. Clara looked at him. Why would you do that? He said it very simply. Because you shouldn't have to fight this alone. She looked at him for a long time. She was looking for the thing underneath it. The angle, the wanting, the thing. She still hadn't found. She was looking very carefully, the way she'd always looked at things that she wanted to trust, but hadn't earned the right to trust yet. She couldn't find it. That scared her more than Edward finding her. Because Edward she knew. Edward she understood completely. And an enemy you understand is survivable. It was the thing she didn't understand yet that kept her up at night. All right, she said. Find out what you can. He nodded. He picked up his tools. Clara, he said. She looked at him. Whatever he says about you, Nathaniel said. Whatever he tells people, I've been working alongside you for 6 weeks. I've seen what you've built. I've seen how you work. And there isn't a person in this county whose opinion I respect who wouldn't see exactly the same thing. She didn't say anything for a moment. That might be the most useful thing anyone said to me in 4 years, she said finally. He left. She stood in the cabin and pressed her hand against her belly and tried to breathe evenly, the way she did when something large was moving toward her, and she needed to stay level to meet it. He's coming, she told her daughter. Your father is coming. Her daughter moved. Clara breathed. But we've got a roof, she said. And we've got walls. And we've got window frames. And that's more than we had 2 months ago. Nathaniel came back Thursday with a name. Not just the name of the person who'd inquired at the land office, a man named Giles, who did legal work for several Helena businesses, and whose connection to Edward Whitmore was, Nathaniel told her, well documented in Helena legal circles. But also a piece of information that landed harder. He's filed a motion in Helena, Nathaniel said, in family court. Clara was sitting at the table she'd built herself 2 weeks ago from leftover timber. She had a cup of coffee in front of her, and she set it down very carefully. What kind of motion? Claiming abandonment of the marital home. Claiming you've placed the unborn child in an unsafe environment. Claiming his paternal rights require the court to... He stopped. Require the court to what? Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her directly. To place you in his custody until the child is born. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the table in front of her. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the grain of the wood she'd cut and fitted and sanded to a surface smooth enough to write on, because her daughter was going to learn to write at this table, and she was going to learn it properly. Then she said, he's asking a court to make me his property again. That's what the motion amounts to, Nathaniel said. Can he do that? He can try, Nathaniel said. The law is... He paused. He said the next part carefully, the way you said things that were true and terrible. The law is not built for your situation, Clara. A married woman's property. A married woman's children. The courts lean toward the husband. Especially a husband with Edward Whitmore's resources. So what do I do? You get to Reardon before the motion comes to a hearing, he said. You get there Monday. I'll ride with you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I'm asking to. She looked at him. Why? She said. Not accusingly, not defensively. She just needed to understand. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, and then he looked at her, and he said, because I'm watching someone fight a battle they shouldn't have to fight alone, and I am in a position to help, and doing nothing would make me the kind of man I don't want to be. He paused. That's all. That's the whole of it. Clara looked at him for a long time. Monday, she said. 6 o'clock. I'll have horses ready. She nodded. She looked back down at the table. He's going to use the baby, she said. Not to Nathaniel exactly, just naming it, putting it where she could see it clearly. He doesn't want the child. He never wanted a child. But he's going to use it because it's the best way to get to me, and a man like Edward always knows where the best place to hit is. Reardon's good, Nathaniel said. He's won cases that looked worse than this. Has he won cases that looked exactly like this? Nathaniel was honest. No, he said. But, then I need to be better than the case, Clara said. I need to give Reardon something that makes this case different from the ones that looked like it. She was thinking out loud now the way she thought through the roof problem, and the gin pole problem, and every other problem that had come at her since June. What does a court believe? What does any of those men in that room believe about a woman like me? She already knew the answer. She'd been building her answer to it for 3 months. They'll see a woman who left her husband, she said. They'll see an unmarried pregnant woman living alone in the mountains. They'll see a scandal, unless I can make them see something else. What else can they see? Clara looked up. A homesteader, she said. A legal claim. A structure built according to code. A woman who has established a residence, a livelihood, a future for her child. Not a woman who ran away. A woman who built something. Nathaniel was looking at her with that expression again. The one she still didn't entirely have a name for. The cabin, he said. The cabin, she said. You want to bring evidence of the cabin to the court hearing. I want them to see that I didn't run into the wilderness to hide, Clara said. I came here to build. There's a difference. A very large legal difference. You'd need documentation. Survey records, construction records, photographs if you can get a photographer out here. Can you get a photographer out here? He was already thinking. There's one in town, Harlan Creek Gazette. He does portraits mostly, but he's got the equipment. I can ask. Ask, Clara said. Monday morning before we leave for Billings. He stood up. He was already moving toward the door, already 3 steps ahead in the planning, and Clara watched him and thought about what it was like to be inside a conversation with someone who moved toward problems rather than away from them. She had been married for 4 years to a man who moved away from problems, who smoothed them over, covered them, made them polite, and then left them for her to carry. She had been married to a man who managed her. And here was a man who, when she said she needed something, started figuring out how to get it. Nathaniel, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said. Just that. She didn't dress it up. He nodded. Something in his face shifted very briefly into something she recognized as genuine, not the careful composure of a man who'd been taught to show the right face to the right people, but the expression underneath all of that, the one that belonged just to him. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when we've won. He left. Clara sat at the table she'd built and let herself think about what it would mean to win, not just in the hearing room in Billings, not just in the legal sense of the word, but in the wider sense of it. What it would mean for her daughter to grow up on this land without the shadow of Edward Whitmore's claim reaching in over everything. What it would mean to have won that, and to have built the thing she'd used to win it with her own hands. The morning they rode to Billings, the photographer came first. He was a nervous young man who spent 20 minutes setting up his equipment and apologizing for it, and then went very quiet and professional when he actually stood behind the camera. He photographed the cabin from 4 angles. He photographed the interior framing. He photographed the survey marker at the boundary of Clara's claim, and at Nathaniel's suggestion, which he made quietly, and which Clara thought about for a moment before she agreed, he photographed Clara herself. Standing in the doorway of her cabin, one hand resting on the doorframe, she'd hung herself, looking into the camera, with the exact expression she'd had on her face the first morning she'd picked up a hammer and decided not to stop. That's the one, the photographer said, and Clara didn't need to see the plate to know he was right. They rode to Billings. Samuel Reardon was exactly what Clara needed, and nothing like what she'd expected. A small man with ink-stained fingers and a mind that moved so fast she had to pay close attention to follow it. He listened to everything she said without interrupting her once, which was already more than most men had ever given her. When she finished, he was quiet for a full minute. Then he said, "The motion is weak. Whitmore's people filed it fast, and they filed it sloppy because they expected you to fold before it came to a hearing. They didn't expect documentation. They didn't expect photographs. They certainly didn't expect—" He glanced at Nathaniel. "They didn't expect you to have independent witnesses of standing who can testify to the state of your residence and your conduct." Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at Reardon. "You're asking me to testify," he said. "I'm asking if you're willing," Reardon said. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She held his gaze. She said nothing. This was not her decision to make for him. She had told him that on the first day, and she held to it now. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I'm willing." Reardon nodded once. "Then we have a case," he said. "It won't be easy. Whitmore's going to make this personal. He's going to say things in that courtroom about Miss Whitfield's character and choices that are going to be—" He paused. "Difficult to sit through." "I've been sitting through what Edward Whitmore says about me for 4 years, Clara said. "A courtroom is just a bigger room." Reardon looked at her. Something in his expression shifted into what she recognized after a moment as respect. "The hearing is in 3 weeks, he said. Clara nodded. She stood up. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to finish the cabin, the interior work, the winter insulation, the second window, and to prepare herself for a room full of men who were going to look at her life and find it wanting. She had done harder things than this. She had built the roof alone. She could hold a room. On the ride back to Harlan Creek, Nathaniel rode beside her in the early dark, and for a long stretch of miles neither of them said anything. The horses moved steadily. The Montana sky was doing the thing it did at dusk, going from that deep, wordless blue into something darker and more complete, and the first stars were coming through in the east. "You don't have to testify," Clara said eventually. Not because she wanted him to back out, because she needed him to know she understood the cost. "I said I would," he said. "Your father is going to be furious," Nathaniel said. "Yes, I know that." He was quiet a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being a piece of something instead of a person." "I shouldn't have." "No," he said. "You should have. It was true." He looked at the dark road ahead of them. "I've been a piece of the Carter Ranch my whole life. Every choice I've made, every woman they've put in front of me, every dinner table and handshake and deal, it was all for the ranch, not for me." He paused. "Standing up in that courtroom and saying what I know to be true about you and what you've built, that's the first thing I'll have done in 34 years that was just for itself, just because it was right." Clara rode beside him in the dark and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "It's going to cost you." "I know," he said. "And you're still going to do it." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at the road ahead of them, the dark line of it winding north toward the Calhoun Valley, toward the 40 acres that were hers, toward the cabin, with its new windows, and its solid north wall, and its ridge beam that had gone up straight, and she thought about what it meant that she was not riding back to it alone tonight. She wasn't going to make it into something it wasn't. She was too careful for that. Too experienced with how quickly things that felt solid could turn out to be just the reasonable face of something else. But she was riding home, and someone was riding beside her, and for the first time in a very long time, the dark didn't feel like something pressing in. It just felt like the dark. And she'd been through the dark before, and she was still here, and her cabin was standing, and in 3 weeks she was going to walk into a courtroom and show a room full of men exactly what she'd built, and she was not going to lose. She pressed one hand against her belly and rode north through the Montana night. Her daughter was quiet tonight, but Clara could feel her there, the particular settled warmth of a child who knew she was not alone. "We've got 3 weeks, Clara said very quietly into the dark. Beside her, Nathaniel Carter said nothing. But he didn't ride ahead, and he didn't fall back, and when the trail narrowed and they had to go single file for a while, he waited for her to take the lead naturally without being asked. And that Clara thought was already more than most people ever managed. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the hardest Clara had ever worked in her life, and that was saying something considerable, given that she'd spent the previous 3 months building a house alone while pregnant. She finished the interior partition wall in 4 days. She got the second window in on the 5th. She packed the north wall insulation with a mixture of moss and dried grass and clay that she'd read about in the building manual and tested on a small section first, which held and then applied across the full wall over 2 days, while the temperature dropped and her fingers went numb by mid-afternoon, and she kept working anyway. She built the storage shelf along the east wall. She sealed the floor seams. She installed the small iron stove properly, with the flue going up through the roof the way it was supposed to, not the temporary arrangement she'd been using since August. Every evening she sat at the table she'd built and went over what Reardon had told her. He'd sent notes from Billings by the county mail, careful, precise notes in small handwriting that she read 3 times each before she put them away. The hearing was before Judge Aldous Crane, who Reardon described as a man of traditional views who responds to evidence presented with dignity. She understood what that meant. It meant she could not walk into that room angry, even when she had every right to be. Anger on a woman's face was all the evidence a man like Aldous Crane needed that a woman was not fit to make her own decisions. She practiced being level. She sat at her table in the evenings and thought about the things Edward was going to say, and she made her face do nothing, and her voice do nothing, and her hands do nothing. She got very good at it. She'd always been good at it. Edward had made her good at it without intending to. Nathaniel came every other day. He didn't come every day because she'd asked him not to, not because she didn't want him there, but because she needed the days alone to think. And she was not yet ready to be the kind of woman who needed someone close by to be able to think straight. She was not sure she ever wanted to be that woman. But Nathaniel accepted it without making her explain it, which was becoming, she acknowledged to herself one evening, a consistent pattern with him. He did not make her explain things. She did not take that for granted. The 10th day before the hearing, a letter arrived. The timber boy brought it out from town. She'd arranged a mail arrangement with him weeks ago, a small payment for the twice-weekly trip, and handed it to her with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who understood he was carrying something significant without knowing what it was. She knew the handwriting before she broke the seal. She'd spent 4 years reading documents written in that hand. Notes left on the hall table. Instructions. Corrections. Edward Whitmore wrote in a very neat, very controlled hand that looked, if you didn't know him, like the hand of a careful and reasonable man. She opened the letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that Edward remained willing to resolve this matter privately, without the involvement of a county court. If Clara would agree to return to Helena and place herself and the child under his guardianship during what he called this difficult period. The second paragraph said that should she refuse this generous offer, he wanted her to understand the nature of what she would face in the courtroom, specifically that he had gathered testimony from 3 Helena women who were prepared to speak to Clara's unstable temperament and her history of irrational behavior, and that he had documentation suggesting her current living situation constituted an unacceptable risk to the welfare of an unborn child. The third paragraph said simply, "You cannot win this, Clara. You never could. Come home." She read it twice. She folded it very precisely along its original creases. She put it in the tin box with her mother's photograph. Then she went outside and picked up her hammer and went back to the storage shelf she'd been installing. And she drove every nail with the particular precision of a woman who had decided that the only response to, "You cannot win this," was to get back to work. When Nathaniel came 2 days later, she showed him the letter. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he folded it back up and handed it to her, and was quiet for a moment. "He's scared," he said. Clara looked at him. "What?" "The offer in the first paragraph," Nathaniel said. "If he thought he was going to win cleanly in that courtroom, he wouldn't have written this letter. He's offering you a way out because he wants one for himself." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't want to stand up in front of a judge and have Reardon ask him questions. He's scared of what he'd have to answer." Clara thought about that. She thought about it the way she thought about structural problems from every angle, testing each point. "The witnesses he mentioned," she said, "the Helena women. They can testify to whatever he's paid them to testify to," Nathaniel said. "Reardon will take them apart on cross." "Can he?" "He will," Nathaniel said. "Trust him." Clara looked at the letter in her hand. "He called it my home," she said. "In the last line, come home. He called his house my home." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "This." She looked at the cabin around them. "This is my home. I built it. My hands built it. He has never built anything in his life that he didn't buy or inherit or take from someone else." She put the letter back in the tin box and closed the lid with a precise final click. He wants me to come home. I'm already there. Nathaniel looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging for weeks now, the one she still couldn't fully name. She'd come close to it a few times. It was in the same family as admiration, but it was something quieter than admiration. Something more personal. Yes, he said. You are. They went back to work. 6 days before the hearing, James Carter rode out again. Alone this time, which Clara noted as information he'd brought hands last time, as ballast as a show of weight, and this time he came alone, which meant something had changed in his calculation. She was outside when he arrived, splitting kindling for the winter woodpile. She set the axe down, but she didn't put it away. "Mr. Carter," she said. He dismounted. He stood by his horse and looked at her, and then he looked at the cabin, and she watched something move through his face. Not what she'd seen before. Not the polite dominance of a man who was sure of his ground, but something more complicated. "You finished it," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For my last visit. The way I spoke to you was—" He paused. "My wife told me it was wrong. She's generally right about such things." Clara looked at him. She was not softened by this. She was interested because James Carter did not look like a man who apologized frequently, and a man who apologized infrequently either meant it deeply when he did, or was deploying it strategically. She was not sure yet which this was. "I accept that," she said. "Was there something else?" He looked at the cabin again. "Nathaniel told me he's testifying." "That's between you and your son," Clara said. "He's going to lose his position in the ranch operation," James Carter said. Not threateningly, factually, which was somehow harder to answer. "I want you to understand that. I am telling you plainly. If he stands up in that courtroom and associates himself publicly with your legal dispute against Edward Whitmore, I will have to—" "Mr. Carter," Clara said, "I understand what you'll have to do, but I need you to understand something too." She picked up the axe again and set another piece of kindling on the block. Not because she needed the wood right now, but because she was not going to stand still and empty-handed while someone explained what they were going to take from people she cared about. She swung. The wood split clean. "Your son is 34 years old. He makes his own decisions, and the decision he's making is to tell the truth in a courtroom about what he has seen with his own eyes. If that costs him something in your operation, that is a cost he has decided he can pay." She set another piece on the block. "The question you should be asking," she said, "is not whether I'll release him from the obligation. I already told you I hold no one here. The question is whether you are the kind of man who will punish his son for telling the truth. Because that is the choice in front of you, not the one you're trying to put in front of me." She swung the axe. James Carter stood in the yard and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You're not what I expected." "No," Clara said. "I don't reckon I am." He mounted his horse. He looked at the cabin one more time. "It's a solid structure," he said. "Yes," said Clara. "It is." He rode away. Clara split 3 more pieces of kindling before she stopped, not because she needed them, but because her hands needed somewhere to put everything she was feeling, and the axe was as good a place as any. That evening, Nathaniel came by, which wasn't his scheduled day. She knew before he dismounted that something had happened. "My father spoke to you," he said. "He did." "What did he say?" "He said what you already know he'd say." She looked at him. "He gave you a position to fill at the ranch. A role. Security. And he's told you what it costs to keep it." "He's giving me until the hearing," Nathaniel said. After that you lose your place in the Carter operation," Clara said. "I know. He told me." She met his eyes. "Nathaniel, I need you to hear me clearly. You do not need to testify. Reardon has the photographs, the survey records, the documentation. It's a strong case without you." "Is it strong enough?" She was honest. "Reardon says it's better with you." "Then I'm testifying." "Your father—" "My father built something his whole life," Nathaniel said. "And I respect that. I genuinely do. but he built it by deciding what everyone around him was worth and what they owed him for his investment in them. And I am—" He stopped. He started again. "I am tired," he said, "of being an asset in someone else's ledger." He looked at her directly. "That courtroom is the first place in my life where I get to say who I am without anyone else's accounting involved. I'm not giving that up." Clara looked at this man who had ridden onto her land 2.5 months ago to tell her his father wanted her to leave, and she thought about everything that had happened between that morning and this one, and she made a decision that she'd been approaching carefully for some time. "All right," she said. "Then we go together." He exhaled, just slightly, just enough. "Together," he said. They rode to Billings, the morning of the hearing. Clara, Nathaniel, and Reardon, who had taken the early train from Billings to meet them at the edge of town, and ride in with them, because he said arriving together, sent a message before they ever entered the room. The message was that Clara Whitfield was not alone. The courthouse in Billings was not a grand building. It was practical and square, and it smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the room where the hearing was held had 6 rows of wooden benches and a high window that let in the morning light at an angle that hit the judge's bench and left everything else in comparative dimness. Edward was already there when they arrived. Clara hadn't seen him in 9 months, and the sight of him landed differently than she'd expected. Not with the old fear, not with anger, but with a clarity so complete, it was almost like looking at something through clean glass for the first time. He was a handsome man. He had always been handsome. He was wearing a suit she recognized because she had picked it out for him in the spring of 1883, which struck her now as the kind of detail that belonged to someone else's life entirely. He saw her come in, and his face did the thing she'd spent 4 years learning to read: the micro-adjustment. The composure recovered, the reasonable expression restored. He nodded to her very slightly. A gentleman's acknowledgement. She looked directly through it and took her seat beside Reardon. Nathaniel sat in the first row of benches directly behind the plaintiff's table. Not at the table that was not his place, but close enough that when she sat down and turned slightly, she could see him, and he was looking at her with an expression that said simply, "I'm here." She turned back to the front of the room. Judge Aldous Crane came in at 9 o'clock. He was older than she'd expected, with white hair and the deliberate movements of a man who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being impressed by anything. He looked at both tables with the same level, unrevealing attention. "We are here on the matter of Whitmore versus Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Whitmore has filed a motion regarding abandonment of the marital home and fitness of the respondent as a custodial presence for the expected child. Mr. Reardon, your client contests this motion." "She does, Your Honor," Reardon said, "on all counts." "Very well. Mr. Whitmore's counsel will present first." Edward's lawyer was a man named Pryor, expensive suit. Helena addressed the particular confidence of someone who charged by the hour and had never lost a case he couldn't buy his way through. He presented Edward's argument smoothly, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times. Clara listened without moving her face. The argument was what she'd expected. She had abandoned the marital home without cause. She had placed herself and the unborn child in conditions of physical danger and social isolation. She had refused her husband's reasonable offers of assistance. She had formed an inappropriate association with a man, not her husband, which called into question her moral fitness as a mother. Then Pryor called his first witness, a woman named Mrs. Delancey from Helena, who testified in a careful, regretful voice that she had known Clara Whitfield for 3 years and had observed in her a pattern of emotional instability, impulsive decision-making, and a troubling tendency to act without regard for the consequences to those around her. Reardon cross-examined her for 4 minutes and established that she had dined at the Whitmore house 8 times in the past year, that Edward Whitmore had personally introduced her to her current employer, and that she had never in 3 years of acquaintance visited Clara Whitfield alone or spoken with her outside of social functions hosted by Edward. The second witness was similar. The third was a doctor, not Clara's doctor. She had not had a doctor which she'd known they would use against her, who testified that the living conditions she'd described in her claim filing were in his medical opinion unsuitable for a woman in her condition. Reardon cross-examined him for 6 minutes and asked him specifically whether he had personally visited the property in question. He had not. Whether he had examined the respondent directly. He had not. Whether his opinion was therefore based entirely on the opposing counsel's description of the property. It was. So your testimony, Reardon said very pleasantly, is that based entirely on what Mr. Pryor told you, and without any direct evidence of your own, you've concluded the property is unsuitable. The doctor recalibrated. The general conditions described. Thank you, Reardon said. No further questions. Then it was their turn. Reardon presented the survey record first. Legal filed complete containing the boundary description, the acreage, the water access rights. All in order. All filed before Edward had begun his legal proceedings. Then the construction documentation, the building permit. Clara had filed in Harlan Creek. The supply receipts, she'd kept every single one of the dated notes she'd made in the margins of the building manual. Then the photographs. He passed them to Judge Crane without comment and let them sit. Clara watched the judge look at the photographs. She watched him look at the one of the cabin from the south, which showed the glass window catching the September light. She watched him look at the interior shot that showed the finished floor and the partition wall and the small iron stove. She watched him look at the last one, the one of Clara herself in the doorway, with the hammer on the frame and that expression on her face. He looked at that one for a long time. Then Reardon called Nathaniel Carter. The room shifted when Nathaniel stood up and moved to the witness chair. Not dramatically, just the small collective adjustment of people recalibrating. Because everyone in that room knew the Carter name. And the Carter name sitting down to testify on behalf of a woman Edward Whitmore wanted to control was not the testimony Pryor had prepared for. Pryor was very still at his table. Edward was very still at his chair. Reardon took Nathaniel through it methodically. How long had he known Miss Whitfield? How had they met? What had he observed of her living conditions over the course of his acquaintance? Nathaniel answered everything directly in plain language, without embellishment. Yes, the cabin was structurally sound. He had helped with specific portions of the work at Miss Whitfield's direction. Yes, the property had reliable water access from the creek. Yes, the interior was insulated and heated. Yes, he had observed Miss Whitfield's work practices over a period of approximately 10 weeks. Yes, in his assessment, the property represented a safe and stable environment. And in your observation of Miss Whitfield's character, Reardon said, and her fitness as a person responsible for a child, what would you say? Nathaniel looked directly at Judge Crane. I would say, he said, that she is the most capable and deliberate person I have encountered in my 34 years. She does not act impulsively. She does not act recklessly. She makes decisions carefully, and she executes them with more competence than most trained builders I've hired on our ranch operations. He paused. She built a house, Your Honor, alone in 3 months in the Montana high country during the latter stages of a pregnancy. I don't know what else you could ask of a person by way of demonstrating their fitness to take care of a child. Pryor was on his feet the moment Reardon sat down. Mr. Carter, he said, and his voice had the particular edge of a man who knows he's in worse trouble than he expected and is deciding how aggressive to be about it. You have described a close acquaintance with Miss Whitfield. Would you characterize that acquaintance as personal? I would characterize it as professional, Nathaniel said evenly. We worked together on a construction project. And nothing more. We are neighbors, Nathaniel said. And I count her as a friend, yes. And this friendship, Pryor smiled, which was the moment Clara knew he was going to say something he thought would land hard. This friendship, Mr. Carter, is it not true that it has been the subject of considerable comment in Harlan Creek, that your association with this woman has been viewed by your own family as inappropriate? My family has opinions, Nathaniel said. They're entitled to them. Your father has expressed concern about this association. My father expresses concern about most things that fall outside his plans, Nathaniel said. That doesn't make those things wrong. Pryor shifted. He was going to the personal now, and Clara knew it before he said it. She made her hands flat on the table and kept her face level. Mr. Carter, Pryor said, isn't it true that your interest in Miss Whitfield goes beyond the professional? that you are in fact personally attached to this woman in a way that compromises your ability to testify objectively about her character and circumstances. Nathaniel looked at Pryor for a long moment. He was composing something. Clara could see it. He was choosing words carefully, the way she had learned to choose words carefully, because the words in this room were going to outlast the room. "Mr. Pryor," Nathaniel said, "I can tell you what I know. I know that for 4 years, the man sitting at that table told everyone who would listen that Clara Whitfield was irrational, unstable, and incapable of managing her own affairs. I know that while he was saying that she was managing the household accounts, the domestic operations, and the social obligations of his life with a precision I'd be proud to see in any foreman I've hired." He paused. "I know that after he threw her out for being inconvenient, she took what was hers, and she built a life with it. I know what I have seen her do with my own eyes. My attachment to that truth does not compromise my testimony. It is my testimony." The room was very quiet. Pryor sat down. Judge Crane looked at the photographs again. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I'd like to hear from you directly." Reardon had prepared her for this. She stood up. She did not look at Edward. She looked at the judge because the judge was the only person in this room whose opinion was going to change anything. "Your Honor," she said, "I am not here to make this man look bad. I am here because he has asked a court to take my child away from me. And I need you to understand that the woman he has described in this courtroom, irrational, unstable, unfit, does not exist." She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still. "I left because I was treated as property, and I refused to continue being property. I built a home because my child deserves to grow up with a roof her mother put over her head with her own hands. I am not fleeing something. I am building something, and I am asking this court to let me finish it." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then, Edward's lawyer was back on his feet, and Edward himself was leaning toward him, saying something low and urgent, and Pryor straightened and said, "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore would like to address the court directly." And Judge Crane said, "Very well." And Edward Whitmore stood up. And Clara, for the first time that morning, looked directly at her husband. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been very good at controlling things, and was watching control slip away from him, and was deciding in real time how much of himself to show in order to get it back. "Your Honor," Edward said, and his voice was exactly what it had always been. Smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man who had never had to raise it because people had always listened before he got loud. "I want to be clear that my only concern in bringing this motion was the welfare of my child." "Your child," Clara said. She said it quietly, but she said it, and the room heard it. Edward's jaw tightened fractionally. "The child I am legally the father of," he said. "Yes. I simply want to ensure that." "You told me the timing was inconvenient," Clara said. Her voice was still level. She had practiced this. She had practiced it 100 times in the dark of her cabin. "Those were your exact words. December, a Tuesday. You set your fork down, and you said the timing was inconvenient." "Clara, you arranged for me to be sent to your sister's house in Butte, like I was a piece of luggage you needed stored somewhere until you got back from Denver." Her hands were flat on the table. Her voice was flat. "You did not ask me what I needed. You did not ask me what I wanted. You told me what had been arranged. And when I said I wasn't going, you told me I wasn't going anywhere." She looked at him. "I am here, Edward. In this courthouse, in this territory on my own land with my own lawyer speaking in my own voice. I went somewhere." The room was very, very still. Edward looked at her across the courtroom with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the reasonable face, not the correcting face, not the patient face, something rawer than any of that. Something that was just the man underneath all those faces, stripped of the carefully maintained surface for just one unguarded second. He looked like a man who had genuinely not believed she could do this. Judge Crane said, "We'll recess for 30 minutes. And that was when Clara knew. Not because the judge had said anything that indicated a decision, but because recesses were what happened when a judge needed to think, and a judge who was certain would not have needed to think. And a judge who needed to think was a judge who had been moved from where he started. She stood up from this table, and Nathaniel was beside her before she'd fully straightened, not touching her just there, which was what she'd needed without knowing it was what she'd needed. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly just for her. "I was honest," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's what I said." She almost smiled. Almost. She pressed her hand against her belly, where her daughter had been moving since the morning, a constant rolling presence that she'd started thinking of as company in the way she'd once thought of fire. "Almost over," she told her. "Just a little longer." Reardon came up behind them and put his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. "He's going to rule for you," Reardon said low. "I've seen that recess before. He's not reconsidering. He's composing." Clara nodded. She did not let herself feel it yet. She had learned not to feel the win before it was actually won, because that was how you left yourself open for the thing you hadn't seen coming. She looked across the room to where Edward was speaking rapidly to Pryor, and Pryor was nodding but not writing anything down, which told her the conversation wasn't productive. Edward looked up and caught her looking at him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "And Clara thought I spent 4 years trying to make you see me. I spent 4 years getting smaller and quieter and more careful, so that you might eventually decide I was worth looking at as a person instead of a problem to be managed. And then I stopped. And I built something. And now you're looking at me, Edward. Now you are absolutely looking at me." She looked away first. Not because he'd won anything, but because she was done. She was finished needing him to see her. She had other things to look at. She turned back to Reardon and said, "What do we do when he rules?" And Reardon told her. And she listened, and she nodded, and she started thinking about what came next, because that was what she did. She looked at what came next, and she started figuring out how to build it. The recess ended. The room reconvened. Judge Crane returned to his bench and looked at both tables with the same level, unrevealing expression he'd worn all morning, and then he began to speak. And Clara folded her hands on the table in front of her and lifted her chin by just a fraction of an inch and listened to every word. Judge Crane settled his reading glasses on his nose and looked at the papers in front of him for a moment before he looked up. The room was the kind of quiet that happens when a group of people are all holding their breath at the same time without having agreed to do it. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he said. His voice was deliberate, unhurried, the voice of a man who understood that what he said next was going to matter to people for a long time. "I have reviewed the survey documentation, the construction records, the photographic evidence, and the testimony given today. I have also reviewed Mr. Whitmore's motion in its original filing and the subsequent documentation submitted by his counsel." He paused. He looked at Edward's table. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "you have claimed that your wife abandoned the marital home without cause, placing herself and your unborn child in conditions of danger and moral risk. You have provided testimony to support this characterization." He looked at Clara's table. "Miss Whitfield, you have contested every element of this characterization and provided substantial documentation in support of your contest." Another pause. Clara kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing even. She did not look at Edward. "It is the finding of this court," Judge Crane said, "that the motion filed by Mr. Whitmore is without sufficient merit to proceed to a full custody hearing." The room moved. Not loudly, just that collective exhale that shift bodies adjusting to a changed reality. "The evidence before me suggests not a woman who has acted irrationally or placed her child in danger, but a woman who has established a legal homestead claim, constructed a habitable residence, and conducted herself with what this court can only describe as remarkable deliberateness." He looked at the photograph again. Clara had noticed him looking at it 3 times during the proceedings, which she had filed away without examining too closely. "The motion is dismissed. Miss Whitfield's homestead claim stands. Questions of custody and paternal rights, should Mr. Whitmore wish to pursue them through appropriate channels after the child's birth, may be addressed at that time through the proper process. This hearing is concluded." He brought the gavel down once. And that was it. Clara sat for a moment without moving. Not because she was stunned. She had been preparing herself for this outcome. She had been building toward it deliberately for 3 weeks. but because winning had a particular physical quality she hadn't expected. A loosening somewhere deep in her chest. Like a knot she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten it was there suddenly released. Reardon was already organizing his papers. He leaned over and said quietly, "Congratulations, Miss Whitfield. That was clean." "Thank you," she said. She stood up. Nathaniel was there before she'd fully turned around, not crowding her, just present the way he always was, close enough to matter and far enough back to let her be herself in her own moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression that had a name. Now she realized it had acquired a name somewhere in the last 3 weeks without her having assigned it one consciously. It was the expression of a man who had decided privately and completely that this woman was the most important person in his life, and who was with considerable discipline. Not saying so yet, because he understood the timing mattered. She recognized it because she had the same expression, probably when she thought he wasn't watching. She turned away from him before either of them had to deal with that directly, because there were more immediate things to deal with first, and because she had learned the hard way that the most important things deserved better than being addressed in the aftermath of a courtroom, while her hands were still shaking slightly from the effort of holding them still. What she hadn't anticipated was Edward. She should have. She knew him. But something about winning cleanly had softened her guard for just a moment, and in that moment, Edward crossed the room. He didn't touch her. He was too careful for that, especially here. He simply appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and said her name and the sound of it in his voice. The old voice, the private voice. Not the courtroom voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned and looked at him. How was closer than she'd expected. Close enough that she could see what was happening behind the composed face. Not quite regret, because she didn't think Edward Whitmore was capable of the full version of regret. But something adjacent to it. Something that was the closest he would ever get. "You should have come home," he said, quietly, just for her. "I would have—" He stopped. "Things could have been different." "No," Clara said. "They couldn't have." "Clara, Edward." She said his name with a flatness that was not anger and not coldness, but something more final than either. "I am not angry at you. I want you to hear that because I think you're expecting anger, and I think you're prepared to work with anger, and I don't want you to have the comfort of that. I'm not angry. I'm finished. Those are very different things." He looked at her for a moment. He had a response prepared. She could see it, the careful sentences being assembled behind his eyes, the reasonable explanation forming, and then something made him stop. Maybe the expression on her face. Maybe the specific quality of the quiet between them. He didn't say the prepared thing. He said, "I hope the child is well." "She will be," Clara said. She walked away from him. She did not look back. Nathaniel was waiting near the door, and he fell into step beside her naturally, without discussion, and they walked out of the courthouse into the Billings afternoon together. Reardon a few steps behind them. The light hit Clara full in the face when she came through the door, and she stopped for just a second and let it, tilting her chin up slightly, because it felt in that moment like the most specific and deserved thing she had ever felt. "What do you need?" Nathaniel said. He said it the same way he'd said it in the cabin the day she told him about Edward's letter. Practical, direct, without performance. "Food," Clara said. "I haven't eaten since 5 this morning, and I'm building a person." He laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere genuine. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Let's get you something to eat." They found a small restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse. The kind of place with checked tablecloths, and a woman who came out from the kitchen herself to take their order and seemed to take it as a personal challenge when Clara said she was very hungry. What she brought out was substantial, and Clara ate without apology, which she'd learned from hard experience was the right way to eat when you needed to. Reardon ate with them, and they talked through the practical things, what Edward could do next, which was limited. What the court's dismissal meant for the custody question after the birth, which was favorable. What Clara needed to document going forward to establish the homestead as a permanent residence. He was efficient about all of it, in the way she'd come to appreciate. He gave her information without dressing it up. And when there were things that were uncertain, he said. So instead of smoothing them over, when he left to catch the train back to Billings, Clara and Nathaniel were alone at the table. They'd been alone many times. But this was different from the cabin. Different from the road. There was no work to organize the silence around. It was just the two of them, and the checked tablecloth, and the sound of the restaurant around them, and the very large fact of what had just happened sitting between them, like something that needed to be acknowledged. "Your father is going to know about today by tomorrow morning," Clara said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He told you what that meant." "He did." She looked at him directly. "What are you going to do?" Nathaniel turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was going to say something true. "I went to see my mother," he said, "before we left for Billings this morning." Clara hadn't known that. She waited. "She's a woman. My father chose well," he said slowly, "in the sense that she is capable and steady, and she has run that household for 30 years with a kind of quiet competence that nobody ever talks about because it looks like just being there. She's always just been there." He paused. "I told her what I was doing today, what it might cost, and she looked at me for a long time and she said—" He stopped. Something moved through his face. "What did she say?" Clara said quietly. "She said, 'Your father chose me because I was practical. I wish someone had chosen me because they couldn't imagine a day without me.'" He set the cup down. "Then she told me to go. She said, 'Go and tell the truth, Nathaniel. Whatever it costs, go tell the truth.'" Clara sat with that for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "She is," he said. "I think the two of you would get along." It was a small thing to say, a careful thing, but it had a shape to it that Clara recognized it was the kind of thing you only said if you were picturing a future in which that meeting happened. And she noticed that, and she noted it, and she put it in the category of things she was going to think about properly when she was home, and not in the aftermath of winning a court case. "I need to tell you something," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "My father called in a debt from the county assessor's office," he said. "Last week, before the hearing. He found a discrepancy in your homestead filing a minor one, a survey notation that was technically incomplete, the kind of thing that gets missed all the time and gets corrected without issue." Clara went very still. "What kind of discrepancy?" "The creek boundary notation," Nathaniel said. "The way it was written, it technically left the water access rights ambiguous. It was a clerical error on the part of the land office, not a mistake you made. But my father flagged it to the assessor and suggested it might be grounds to challenge the claim." She looked at him. She was very careful about how she asked the next question. "When did you find this out?" "4 days ago," he said. "4 days ago." She repeated it without heat, naming it. "Yes." He met her eyes. "I had Reardon look at it. He believes it's correctable a refiling with the proper notation supported by the survey records we already have. It's not a threat to the claim if it's addressed quickly." He paused. "I should have told you immediately. I'm telling you now." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the thing she always did when something landed hard. She was finding the structure of it, the weight of it, the exact place where it connected to what she already knew. "You waited 4 days," she said. "I waited 4 days because I didn't want to put one more thing on your shoulders 3 days before a court hearing," he said. "That was my decision to make, and I made it. If you think it was wrong, say so." "It was wrong," she said flatly. "I don't need to be protected from information about my own property. That is precisely the thing I have been fighting against for 4 years a man, deciding what I was strong enough to handle and parceling out my own life to me in pieces he judged appropriate." She held his gaze. "You don't get to do that. Not you, not anyone. Do you understand me?" "Yes," he said. He didn't flinch. He didn't explain himself again. He just said yes and meant it and held her gaze the whole time. She looked at him. She was angry. She wanted to be clear about that to herself with the same honesty she applied to everything. She was genuinely angry. And underneath the anger was something else, the specific hurt of someone who had lowered a wall slightly, and then found on the other side of it a thing that reminded her of why she'd built the wall in the first place. "Is there anything else?" she said. "Anything else you've been managing on my behalf without telling me?" "No," he said. "That's everything." She nodded once. She looked at the table. Then she looked back up at him. "When we get back to Harlan Creek," she said, "you and I are going to Reardon to sort out the filing, together, with me in the conversation at every step. Not after you've figured it out, not when it's resolved, at every step. That's the condition." "Yes," he said. "And if something like this happens again—" "It won't," he said. "Nathaniel." "It won't," he said again, and this time it wasn't a reassurance. It was a commitment. There was a difference, and she heard it. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. The restaurant moved around them, ordinary and indifferent people eating their midday meals and not knowing or caring that the woman at the corner table had just won back her life in a courthouse 2 blocks away. "Thank you," she said finally. "For today. For the testimony. For all of it." "You did most of it yourself," he said. "I know," she said. "But you did your part." He smiled at that. Not the polite smile, the real one, the slightly crooked one that she'd only started seeing in the last few weeks, and that she had not yet told him she'd noticed, because some things you kept to yourself until you knew what to do with them. They rode back to Harlan Creek in the late afternoon. The light was going golden by the time they reached the valley, the particular Montana autumn gold that made the timber look like it was lit from inside. Clara didn't talk much on this ride, and Nathaniel didn't push her, which she appreciated. She was processing the ruling Edward's face when he said she should have come home. Nathaniel's mother's words, the creek boundary problem, all of it moving through her, the way water moved through the terrain, she now knew better than she'd known any land in her life. When they reached the boundary of her claim, she pulled up her horse and stopped. She could see the cabin from here. She could see the south window catching the last of the afternoon light. Her window, her glass fitted by her hands. She could see the smoke coming from the flue she'd installed properly because she'd started keeping a fire banked during the day in preparation for the cold that was coming. She could see the woodpile along the east wall split and stacked in the precise rows she maintained because order was something she'd decided to give herself the way other people gave themselves comfort. "It's still standing," she said. "It is," Nathaniel said. She sat there a moment longer. "She's going to be born here," Clara said. Her daughter was moving that rolling presence that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Right there, in that cabin, in the room I built." She pressed her hand against her belly without thinking about it. "She's going to know this land before she can walk. She's going to grow up knowing that women build things." Nathaniel didn't say anything. He just sat his horse beside her and let her have the moment, which was the right thing to do. And she filed it away under the heading of things about this man that she was not yet done understanding. "Come on," she said. "We've got work tomorrow." She rode home. The creek boundary correction took 2 weeks to resolve. Reardon handled it in Billings, and Clara was, as she'd required, part of every conversation. Nathaniel sent her copies of every letter before it went out, and when there was a decision to be made about approach, he asked rather than decided, and she told him what she wanted. It was, she acknowledged to herself one evening, the most functional working relationship she'd ever had with a man. And then she acknowledged more carefully that it had moved some distance past a working relationship, and that both of them knew it, and neither of them had said so yet. And the question was, which of them was going to say it first, and when? She'd been thinking about that question with the same methodical attention she brought to structural problems. 3 days after the creek boundary was formally corrected, James Carter rode out to her property for the 3rd time. Clara was inside when she heard him. She recognized his horse now, the particular heavy canter of a large animal, ridden by a large man with a certain authority. She came to the door and stood in it. He dismounted. He looked at the cabin. He'd been looking at it every time he came, and each time the expression shifted a little more from assessment toward something she didn't have a word for yet. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitfield." He took his hat off. She'd never seen him take his hat off when he was outside. It was a deliberate thing, and she noted it. "I won't take much of your time. I only came to say—" He paused. He was a man who had not had much practice with what he was trying to say, and it showed, and she found that she respected him more for the difficulty than she would have if it had come easily. "I was wrong about you. In my assessment. In how I spoke to you. I was wrong." Clara looked at him. I know what that cost you, she said. Saying that. Not as much as it should have, maybe, he said. Sooner. He turned his hat in his hands. Nathaniel tells me the claim is clear. The filing is corrected. It is. Good. He nodded once. You're going to be a neighbor for a long time then. I expect so, she said. He put his hat back on. He looked at the cabin one final time with the expression she still couldn't name, and then she realized what it was. It was the same expression Nathaniel had worn the first day he looked at the ridge beam. It was the expression of a person looking at a thing that had earned something. My wife would like to call on you, he said. When you're ready, when the baby comes. Clara thought about the woman who had told her son to go and tell the truth, whatever it cost. I'd be glad of that, she said. He nodded. He mounted. He rode north without another word, and Clara stood in her doorway and watched him go, and thought about how much territory a person could cover in a few months, not in miles, but in the kind of understanding that changed who you were to the people around you. Nathaniel came that evening. He came in the way he always came now, with a knock on the open doorframe, and a look that asked permission before his feet asked it, and she waved him in, and he sat at her table in the chair he'd started thinking of as his, without either of them having assigned it, and she put coffee in front of him without being asked, because she always made enough for two. Now without thinking about it. And neither of them commented on any of this, because to comment on it would have been to examine it more directly than they were ready for. He looked tired. Not physically. Nathaniel didn't show physical tiredness easily. It was the other kind. Your father came today, she said. I know, he told me. He apologized. I know that too. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He also told me I was right about the testimony. Not those words exactly. But he said the Carter name attached to that courtroom was the reason Crane ruled as quickly as he did. That it was a strategic asset. He paused. That's my father saying it was the right call. He just can't say it directly. Some people are like that, Clara said. He said he's restoring my position in the operations. She looked at him, and she said because she could hear the shape of what hadn't been said yet. And he wants me to take a more active role, Nathaniel said. Decision-making. He's getting older. He doesn't say that my father would not say that, but he's starting to see it, I think, and he's... He stopped, started again. He's trying to hand me something I actually want to receive. That's new. Is it something you want? Clara said. Not what he wants you to want. What you want. He looked at her. I want... He stopped. He was composing again very carefully, and she waited. I want to build something, he said. I have always wanted to build something, not inherit, not receive, build. Then build something, she said. Yes, he said. That's what I'm trying to figure out how to do. They looked at each other across the table she had built from leftover timber. The fire in the iron stove made a small sound. Outside the Montana dark was complete now the particular depth of an autumn night in the high country, and the cabin was warm and solid, and exactly what she'd set out to make it. Nathaniel, Clara said. She said it the way she'd said his name the first time on the day she told him his father's threat was between him and his father, directly without softening. I need to say something to you. All right, he said. He set the cup down. I have been very careful, she said. With you, since the beginning. I have been watching you the way I watch structural problems, looking for the weak point, the place where the thing fails. Because I have lived inside a failure that looked fine from the outside for 4 years, and I need to know where the failure is before I trust something. He was very still. And I have not found it, she said. I've been looking, and I have not found it. There was the 4 days with the creek boundary, and I said what I needed to say about that, and you heard it, and that was... She paused. That was how it's supposed to work. That's the thing I didn't know how to have before. Clara. I'm not finished, she said. He closed his mouth. I don't need saving, she said. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I saved myself. I built this. I stood in that courtroom and I said what was true, and I won. I did that. She held his gaze. But I am tired of doing everything alone. And I think I have been thinking for some time that doing things alone and doing things beside someone who is trustworthy are two very different things. And I have been confusing them because for a long time the only options I had were alone or controlled. And you are—" She stopped. "I'm what?" he said quietly. "You are not Edward," she said. "You are something I don't entirely have a name for yet, but you are not that, and that matters more than I can tell you." Nathaniel looked at her across the table for a long moment. "Can I say something now?" he said. "Yes. The morning I rode out here," he said, "the first morning I was going to do exactly what my father wanted. I was going to speak politely to a woman I expected to be some combination of frightened and foolish, and I was going to be kind about it, and I was going to come home and tell my father she'd be gone by spring, and I was going to go back to being a piece of the Carter Ranch." He paused. "And then I saw you on that roof." Clara said nothing. "You looked at me," he said, "like I was the one who didn't belong. And I was. I was on your land, uninvited, with my father's agenda in my pocket, and you looked at me like you could see all of that clearly and had already decided what it was worth." He shook his head slightly. "I went home that day, and I sat on my porch until it was dark, and I could not stop thinking about a woman who looked at the world like it was a problem she'd already figured out how to solve." "I hadn't figured it all out," Clara said. "No," he said. "But you were figuring it out. There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "I have never in my life met anyone who I wanted to work beside. Not for, beside. Until you. And I don't—" He paused. "I don't know what to call that exactly. But I know I'm not interested in being anywhere you're not." The fire made another small sound. Clara looked at this man who had ridden onto her land as an obstacle and become somewhere in the months since something she was building her future around without having decided to the way the best structures came together. Not because you forced them into shape, but because you understood the materials well enough to let them find their own strength. "You could build something here," she said, carefully, testing the weight of the words as she said them. "On this land. A proper operation, the 40 acres is enough to start. The creek access is confirmed. The timber is substantial. There's room for—" "Clara," he said. "I'm being practical," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That's what I like about you." He almost smiled. "You propose a partnership by talking about timber." "Timber is important," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It is." They looked at each other. "I'm not ready to call it more than a partnership yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said. "The baby is coming in 6 weeks. There are things I need to establish before I—" She stopped. "I need my daughter to grow up knowing her mother made her own decisions. About everything." "I understand," he said. "Do you—" "Yes," he said. "I'll wait." She looked at him. "You don't know how long—" "Doesn't matter," he said simply. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the cabin around her, the walls. She'd raised the roof. She'd fitted the floor. She'd laid the stove that was heating the room right now with a fire she'd built. All of it hers. All of it chosen. "There's one more thing," she said. "Name it." "When I said the baby is coming in 6 weeks," she said, "that means there are things this cabin needs that aren't built yet. I need a proper cradle. I need the sleeping area partition reinforced. I didn't account for winter weight on it when I built it. I need the BA, Saturday," Nathaniel said. "I'll come Saturday with lumber. I haven't finished the list." "You can give me the rest of the list Saturday," he said. "I'll write it down." Clara looked at him. 5:30, she said. 5, he said. She let the almost smile happen. Just briefly. She was too careful to let it stay long, but she let it happen, and he saw it, and it was enough. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He carried the cup to the shelf she'd built beside the stove and set it there in the particular place he always put it when he was done, which she had noticed was always exactly the same spot, which told her something about the kind of man he was. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. He went out. She heard him mount and ride north. She sat at her table in the warm, solid, unassailable fact of her home, and pressed her hand against the place where her daughter was turning in that slow, dreaming way she had in the evenings, the way that felt like she was saying, I am here. I am here. I am here. We won, Clara told her. Her daughter moved. And it turns out, Clara said, we didn't have to win alone. That's a new thing. We're going to have to figure out what to do with that. She sat in her home for a while longer in the dark and the warmth, thinking about what she was going to build next. She had plans for the spring. Not just for the homestead, though she had those two very specific plans drawn out in the building manual's margins over the past weeks. Plans for a second structure, a proper barn positioned to take advantage of the south-facing slope. Plans for expanding the claim if the adjacent parcel came available. Plans for a kitchen garden on the east side where the soil ran deep. But also other plans. Less certain ones. The kind that didn't have specifications yet, that were still just the sense of a shape. The shape of what a life could look like when it was built by two people who had agreed to be beside each other, rather than in front of each other, or behind each other, or in the business of managing each other. She had no model for that. She had never seen it done. Every marriage she'd witnessed had been a negotiation of who managed whom, dressed up in the language of love or duty or propriety, depending on the occasion. What she and Nathaniel were building, whatever it was, did not look like any of those things. It looked like two people who had been trying to figure out how to build something for their whole lives, and had each separately concluded they needed to do it alone, and had then met each other on a piece of Montana high country, and discovered there was a version of building that neither of them had known existed. She got up and banked the fire for the night. She moved through the cabin with the lamp checking the things she always checked: the stove, flue, the door latch, the windowsills. Her nightly round, the domestic version of the cabin walk she'd done every evening when the walls were first going up, checking each timber, each joint, looking for weakness before the weakness found her. Everything held. She put the lamp down on the table. She put her hands flat on the surface of it, the table she'd built from leftover timber, with no manual to follow, and no one to tell her if she was doing it right, and she felt the wood under her palms, solid and real. Then she went to bed in the room she'd built for herself and her daughter, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she did not lie awake. She slept. The snow came the second week of November, which was 2 weeks earlier than the building manual had predicted for the altitude, and earlier than anyone in Harlan Creek had expected. It came overnight, and it came hard, and Clara woke to the particular silence that meant the world outside had been covered in something heavy and muffling and total. She was 38 weeks along. She had been moving through the last weeks with the particular economy of motion she'd developed by necessity. Everything she did now was planned, measured, conserved, because her body was directing its resources somewhere very specific, and she was going to be sensible about it. She got up. She checked the flue clear. She built the morning fire. She put the kettle on. She stood at the south window and looked at the snow covering her land, and thought with a satisfaction she felt no need to qualify that the roof was holding. She was in the middle of her second cup of coffee when she heard the horse. She knew the step. She knew it before the rider cleared the tree line. Nathaniel came in from the cold with snow on his coat, and the particular expression he got in winter mornings, slightly more awake than the situation called for. Like the cold worked on him, the opposite way it worked on most people. "You're early," she said. "The snow came," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I'm not fragile, Nathaniel." "I know that," he said. He hung up his coat. He stood by the stove and thawed his hands. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been carrying a person for 9 months," she said. "How are you feeling?" He looked at her with that expression. "Like I'm exactly where I should be," he said. She handed him a cup of coffee. I took it in the same spot. He always took it standing by the stove where he could see the whole room, and she could see his face, and she thought about what it meant that she had a person in her home whose place in it had been established so gradually and so organically that she couldn't have identified the exact moment it happened. "The cradle's done," he said. "I finished it last night. I'll bring it tomorrow." "The joinery," she said. "Mortise and tenon," he said. "The way you specified." She nodded. She thought about her daughter sleeping in a cradle built to her mother's specifications by a man who had listened to what she said she wanted and done it the way she said. "Thank you," she said. They sat that morning at the table, and he helped her go through the winter supply inventory, what she had, what she needed, what could wait and what couldn't. He'd brought things on the horse packed carefully: salt pork cornmeal lamp oil, a tin of the particular tea she'd mentioned once, without thinking that he'd apparently filed away somewhere and purchased at the general store without comment. She held the tea tin and looked at it for a moment. "I mentioned this once," she said. "You mentioned it on the third day we worked together," he said without looking up from the inventory list. "You said it was the one thing you hadn't been able to find in Harlan Creek." She set the tin down. She made a decision. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "I told you I wasn't ready to call it more than a partnership," she said. "Yes," he said carefully. "I'm ready," she said. He was very still for a moment. "To call it something else," he said. "I don't have the exact word yet," she said. "But I know it's not a word that means I'm doing this alone, and I know it's not a word that means you're in charge of it, and I know it includes the tin of tea, and the mortise and tenon cradle, and the fact that you come at 5 instead of 5:30, because you think I don't notice, and I always notice." He looked at her. "Clara," he said, "don't make it more than it needs to be right now," she said. "Just tell me if you understand what I'm saying." "I understand," he said, very quietly. "Good," she said. She picked up her pencil and went back to the inventory list. I watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to the list too. And they sat together at the table she'd built in the cabin she'd built on the land she'd claimed, two people doing the ordinary and essential work of preparing for what came next, and it was the most natural thing in the world. 4 days later, Clara's daughter was born. The labor began before dawn and lasted through the morning and into the early afternoon, and it was harder than anything she had done, including the ridge beam and the courtroom. And she did not say once that she couldn't do it, because she did not believe in saying things she didn't mean. Nathaniel had ridden for the midwife the moment Clara told him which she'd let him do, because she understood the difference between accepting help and needing someone to manage her, and getting a midwife was just sense. He'd ridden back and stayed outside. She'd told him to stay outside, and he had, without argument, without hovering at the door, just outside close enough to hear if something was wrong, far enough to give her the room she needed. When the midwife came out and told him, he came inside. Clara was in the sleeping area in the bed she'd built, and her daughter was in her arms, and the daughter was very new and very determined looking, with Clara's dark hair, and a face still figuring itself out, and Clara was looking at her with an expression that she would never be able to describe to anyone, and didn't try to. Nathaniel came to the doorway. He stopped there. Clara looked up at him. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood by the bed and looked at the child, and his face did something she'd never seen it do before. All the composure, all the careful management of expression that he'd practiced for 34 years just dissolved. He looked like a man who had been handed something he'd given up hoping for so long ago that he'd stopped knowing he was still hoping for it. He said. He stopped. "I know," Clara said. "What's her name?" Clara looked at her daughter. She'd been thinking about this for months. She'd been thinking about it the night she drove the nail and split her palm. She'd been thinking about it on the road to Billings. She'd been thinking about it in the courtroom when she said, "I am not running, I am building." "Margaret," she said, "for your mother." Nathaniel stood very still. "You don't have to," he started. "I want to," Clara said. She told her son to go tell the truth. That's worth something. She looked down at her daughter. "Margaret Whitfield." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, the chair she'd put there exactly for this purpose in the sleeping area she'd built. And he looked at the child who bore his mother's name, and Clara watched something settle in him, something deep and structural, the way a building settled when the weight was finally properly distributed. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. The baby turned her head very slightly toward his voice. "She knows you," Clara said. "She doesn't know me yet," he said. "She'll learn," Clara said. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. And between them was everything they hadn't said yet, all the things that were still being built, all the names for things that hadn't been assigned yet, all the future that was sitting in that room waiting to be constructed piece by piece, the way everything worth having had to be, with patience, with attention, with two people deciding together what shape it was going to take. "She'll learn," Nathaniel said, and he meant more than the baby. Yes, Clara said. We all will. Outside, the Montana winter was settling in with its full weight. The snow was on the ground and the temperature was dropping, and the season was making every promise it knew how to make, about difficulty and endurance, and the very long road between November and spring. Inside the cabin that Clara Whitfield had built with her own hands, a fire burned in the iron stove she'd installed properly, and a child breathed her first full day of life in a bed her mother had built, and two people sat together in the particular quiet of a thing just beginning, and the walls held. They held exactly the way she'd built them to hold. Margaret Whitfield learned to cry before she learned anything else, which Clara took as a sign of good character. She cried with a specificity that Clara came to respect, not indiscriminately, not from habit, but with intention. Hungry cry. Cold cry. The particular cry that meant she wanted to be held and was not interested in negotiating about it. Clara learned the difference within the first week, partly because she was paying close attention, and partly because Margaret seemed to be making a deliberate effort to communicate clearly, which Clara appreciated from anyone regardless of age or vocabulary. Nathaniel learned the difference by the second week. He was there most mornings now, arriving before the light. Most days, sometimes before Clara herself was fully awake, and she'd hear the door. He always knocked, even now, even with the cold, and then the sound of him making the fire, and the sounds of him moving through the cabin, with the particular quiet consideration of a man who understood that there was a child sleeping, and that a sleeping child was a resource to be conserved. Clara watched him learn her daughter, the way she'd watched him learn the cabin work methodically, without pretending to know more than he did, adjusting when the evidence told him to adjust. The first time Margaret cried in his arms, and he looked at Clara with a question that was purely genuine. No performance in it. No pretense of competence. He didn't have. Clara felt something shift in a place she'd kept very carefully defended for a very long time. She told him what Margaret needed. He did it. It worked. He looked down at the child in his arms who had stopped crying and was now studying his face with the focused, slightly judgmental attention of a very new person encountering an unfamiliar object, and he said, "She's thinking about something." "She's always thinking about something," Clara said. "Like her mother," he said. "Don't start," Clara said. But the almost smile happened, and this time she let it stay a little longer because she was too tired from new motherhood to maintain the full discipline of it, and he saw it and had the good sense not to comment. December moved through the cabin with its particular demands. The cold came down hard in the second week. The kind of cold that tested every seal and every joint and every decision Clara had made about insulation, and the cabin held every test. The north wall she'd packed with moss and clay and dried grass turned out to be the warmest section of the whole structure, which she noted with the satisfaction of someone whose calculations had proven out under actual conditions. Nathaniel reinforced the door seal when he noticed it letting in a draft. He didn't ask, he simply arrived one morning with the right materials and spent 40 minutes on it, while Clara fed Margaret and watched him work. And when he was done, he tested it 3 times and then said, "That'll hold," and moved on to the next thing without ceremony. She thought about the version of help she'd spent 4 years accepting from Edward, the kind that came with an accounting, with a reminder, with a subtle ledger of what was owed. She thought about the way help had always felt like debt, in another form obligation, dressed in generosity. This didn't feel like that. This felt like two people sharing the weight of a thing, because that was simply the more sensible way to carry it. She was still thinking about the right word for what they were to each other. She'd been thinking about it since November. Since the morning she'd told him she was ready to call it something different. She'd been approaching it the way she approached every structural problem from multiple angles, testing each point, refusing to commit to a solution until she understood the load it would have to bear. The word wasn't the issue. She knew what the word was. The issue was what came after the word. The issue was the shape of the life she was building, and whether that life was being built the right way, on the right foundation, by someone who had made her own choices freely, and not because the winter was long and the cabin was small, and there was a man who brought her tea and built her daughter a mortise and tenon cradle. She needed to be certain. So she watched. She watched him with Margaret, how he held her when Clara needed her hands free. How he talked to her in a low, matter-of-fact voice that made the baby turn her head and fix her dark eyes on him with that focused attention that said she had decided he was worth listening to. She watched how he talked to Clara directly, without managing her asking when he had questions, and accepting the answers she gave without second-guessing them. She watched how he moved through the space she'd built, always with that particular care, never rearranging what she'd arranged, never assuming what he hadn't been offered. She watched for the bedrock, the thing underneath the reasonable surface, the hard place where the real man lived. She found it in January. A letter came from Helena, not from Edward this time, but from Edward's lawyer Pryor. A single page, very formal, informing Miss Whitfield that Mr. Whitmore intended to file for formal recognition of paternal rights following the birth of the child, a process which would, Pryor's careful language suggested, require Clara to present herself and the child before a Helena court within 60 days. Clara read it twice. She put it on the table. She picked up Margaret and sat down and looked at the letter on the table in front of her. Nathaniel arrived an hour later and read it standing at the table without sitting down, and when he finished, he set it down with a controlled precision that she recognized it was the same thing she did when she was managing something large and did not want it to show. "He didn't stop," Nathaniel said. "I didn't think he would," Clara said. "You're not surprised?" "No," she said. "Are you?" He was quiet a moment. "No," he said. "I'm angry." She looked at him. "Tell me." "He stood in that courtroom," Nathaniel said, "and he listened to you say everything that was true, and the judge told him it wasn't enough, and he went home, and he waited 2 months, and now he's coming again." He picked up the letter. He set it down. "He's going to keep coming, until you can't afford to keep fighting him, or until you're too tired to keep fighting him, or until he finds a judge who likes him better than Crane liked him." He looked at her. "He's betting on attrition." "Yes," Clara said. "That's Edward." "Then we need Reardon." "Yes. And we need to file something in return," he said. "Not just defend. File something of our own." Reardon talked about the option of establishing the homestead as primary residence of record, getting a formal declaration from the county about your independent legal status. If we move first, we control the ground. Clara looked at him. "We," she said. He met her eyes. "If you'll allow it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "You said you were angry," she said. "I am." "What does that feel like?" she said, not to challenge him, genuinely because she wanted to know. He thought about it. "Like I want to stand between you and whatever he's sending," he said. "And like I know I'm not allowed to do that, not the way I want to, not just step in front of it, and that's the harder part. Watching someone He stopped. "Finish it," she said quietly. "Watching someone I love," he said, "get aimed at again and again by a man who is doing it because he can't stand that she got away from him, and knowing that what she needs is not someone to fight for her, but someone to fight beside her, and trying to be that when every instinct I have is telling me to just stop it. Just make it stop." The room was very quiet. Margaret made a small sound and resettled herself in Clara's arms. Clara looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. "That's the word," she said. He looked at her. "You said it," she said. "That's the word I've been looking for." He understood what she meant. She watched him understand it, the particular shift in his face that happened when something he'd been holding very carefully was suddenly allowed to put its weight down. "Clara," he said. "Don't make it more than it needs to be," she said. "We've got a letter to answer, and a lawyer to contact, and a 60-day window. But—" She paused. "Yes, that's the word." He stood there for a moment with everything he was feeling moving through him without his usual management of it, and she let him have that because it seemed only fair. Then he said, "All right, let's answer the letter." They wrote to Reardon that afternoon together. Clara with Margaret in the crook of one arm, and Nathaniel across the table with the pen, and they laid out what Pryor had sent and what they wanted to do about it. And the letter that came back from Reardon 6 days later confirmed what Nathaniel had said: move first, move fast, establish the ground before Edward's people could frame it. Reardon filed in the 3rd week of January. He filed a formal declaration of legal residency, a petition for recognition of Clara's independent legal status as a homesteader of record, and a counter-motion that asked the Helena court to show cause for why a paternity proceeding should supersede the already settled custody question from the November ruling. And then something happened that none of them had anticipated. Edward withdrew the motion. Not quietly, not without comment. A brief note from Pryor to Reardon, which Reardon forwarded to Clara with 3 words of his own appended, "He's out." Finally, Clara read Reardon's note on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was sleeping and Nathaniel was working on the barn foundation. They'd begun laying out along the south-facing slope, exactly where she'd planned it in the building manual's margins. She read it twice. She carried it outside to where Nathaniel was working and handed it to him without saying anything. He read it. He looked up. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He stood up from where he'd been crouching over the foundation line and looked at her with an expression that was partly relief and partly something more complicated. The expression of a man who had been braced for impact for long enough that the absence of it required a moment of adjustment. "Why?" he said. "Why now?" Clara had been thinking about that since she read the note. "Because Reardon's filing named what he was doing," she said. "Counter-motions cause requirements. It turned it from something he could manage quietly into something that was going to be on record. Edward doesn't like things on record." She looked at the note in his hand. "And I think he found someone else to be reasonable at. A man like Edward always finds the next audience. He can't do what he does without one." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about that. She did him the courtesy of actually thinking about it rather than answering reflexively. "Yes," she said. "I think I expected to feel something larger, but mostly I just—" She looked at the barn foundation he'd been laying out. "I mostly want to talk about the east wall of the barn because I've been thinking about the timber framing, and I think you've got the anchor point 2 feet too far south." He looked at the foundation line. He looked back at her. "You're sure?" he said. "Get the survey notes," she said. "I'll show you." He got the survey notes. She showed him. He looked at the numbers and at the ground, and then he picked up the marking stake and moved it 2 feet north and said, "You're right," with the simple directness of a man who didn't have a complicated relationship with being wrong when the evidence was clear. "I usually am," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You usually are." They went back to work. The barn went up through February and into March slower than the cabin, because they were doing it right from the beginning. Full framing, proper foundation, a structure that was built to last rather than built to pass the winter. They worked weekdays when Nathaniel could get away from the Carter operation, which was most of them since James had given him significant latitude in his schedule in the months since November. A change that neither of them discussed directly, because some changes didn't need to be examined, they just needed to be used. Margaret watched from the sling Clara wore her in during working hours. This had been a practical solution. Clara's hands were needed, and Margaret required proximity, and it had turned out to be something else as well. The baby watched the work, the way she watched everything with that focused, serious attention. She watched her mother's hands on the timber. She watched the frame go up joint by joint. She felt the vibration of the hammer. "She's going to want to build things," Nathaniel said one afternoon. "Good," Clara said. "There are always things that need building." "She's got your eyes," he said, "and your expression when she's looking at something she's figured out." "She's 2 months old," Clara said. "She hasn't figured anything out yet." "She's figured out that it's worth paying attention," he said. "That's not nothing." Clara looked at her daughter's face turned toward the half-built barn wall with that particular focus. "No," she said. "It isn't." The thaw came in the first week of April, the particular Montana spring thaw that arrived like an argument being settled. One day, the snow was absolute, and the next, the creeks were running, and the ground was soft, and everything smelled like something beginning. On the morning of the thaw, James Carter rode out. Clara had come to understand James Carter over the winter, not to like him without reservation, because he was a complicated man who had done real damage with his uncomplicated certainties, but to see him clearly. He was a man who had been wrong and had discovered it gradually and was making the corrections available to him, which was more than many men did. He came out most weeks now. Sometimes with Eleanor, his wife, whose company Clara had come to genuinely value. She was, as Nathaniel had said, someone worth knowing, a woman who had lived her whole life inside the shape other people cut for her and had managed within those constraints to remain entirely herself, which was a different kind of strength than the one Clara had developed, but no less real for that. This morning, James came alone, and he tied his horse at the post. Nathaniel had put up in November, which had become the understanding. James Carter came to this land and tied his horse at the post, not in the field, not at the fence, at the post on the terms of the household. Clara was outside with Margaret when he arrived. Margaret was awake and indignant about something, as she often was in the mornings, and Clara was walking with her along the east wall of the cabin, the particular walk that settled her, and she stopped when James dismounted. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitfield." He looked at Margaret with the expression he'd developed over the winter, a kind of helpless softening that he'd clearly not anticipated and was still making his peace with. "Morning, Miss Margaret." Margaret looked at him with her father's eyes. "Nathaniel's in the barn," Clara said. "I know," James said. "I came to see you." She looked at him. "Walk with me," he said. She walked with him along the edge of the property, Margaret against her chest, the spring ground soft under their feet. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she'd learned was his preparation, his version of composing. "I want to say something to you," he said, "that I should have said months ago, maybe a year ago." "All right," she said. "When Nathaniel first came out here," James said, "and I sent him, I was thinking about my fence line, about the operation, about what your presence here represented in terms of complications." He paused. "I was not thinking about you as a person. You were an obstacle that needed managing. I want you to know I understand that now, and I understand how wrong it was." Clara walked and said nothing, giving him the space to finish. "My son is different," James said. "Since he is—" He paused, and something in his voice shifted into something genuine and slightly unguarded. "He is better than I made him. He was always better than I made him, I think. But you gave him somewhere to put it." Clara looked at the barn that Nathaniel was working in right now, where she could hear the particular rhythm of the hammer she'd learned to distinguish from any other. "He gave himself somewhere to put it," she said. "I just didn't get in the way of it." James Carter looked at her sideways. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" he said. "I gave you a compliment," she said. "Your son is a good man. You raised him." "Eleanor raised him," James said. "I gave him the land." "The land helped," Clara said. He almost smiled. She'd noticed he and Nathaniel had the same almost smile. It sat in the same place, came from the same place. A family resemblance of expression that she found unexpectedly something close to tender. "There's something I want to offer you," James said. "And I want you to understand, I'm making this offer because it's right, not because I expect anything from it." She looked at him. "The parcel east of your claim," he said. 60 acres. It shares your creek access, and the timber runs together. It would make this into a real operation rather than a homestead." He kept his eyes forward. "I want to transfer it to you, to your name. Clear title, no conditions, no entailment." Clara stopped walking. She stood there in the April morning with her daughter against her chest and looked at James Carter. "That's Carter land," she said. "It's land I bought and never used," he said. "It sits between your claim and the ridge. It doesn't do anything but hold its boundary." He turned and looked at her directly. "It would do a great deal more as yours." She was very still for a moment. "Why?" she said, not suspiciously, just needing to understand. He was quiet for a moment. "Because my son loves you," he said simply. "And because you won a court case with your bare hands, and a photograph, and because Eleanor likes you better than she's liked anyone in 30 years, and because—" He stopped. He looked at this cabin. He looked at the barn. He looked at the property that had been, when she arrived, a piece of land nobody wanted, and was now something that had a shape to it, a purposefulness, the particular quality of a place where someone had decided what they were going to build and had built it. "Because you were right," he said. When you told me the question wasn't whether you'd release Nathaniel from an obligation. The question was whether I was the kind of man who punished his son for telling the truth. He looked at her. I thought about that every day for 2 months. I am trying to be the other kind of man. Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to accept this. Not the land, not the 60 acres, but the thing the 60 acres represented. The willingness of a man who had been wrong to keep making corrections until the corrections became a different way of being in the world. She had built her whole life on refusing to accept things that came with strings attached. This didn't have strings. She'd looked. She'd looked the way she looked at everything from every angle. I'll need to see the survey records, she said. James Carter exhaled, just slightly. Of course, he said. And the title transfer goes to my name only, she said. Whitfield, not Whitmore, and not Carter. Understood. And I'll want Reardon to review it before I sign anything. Naturally. She nodded once. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He looked at Margaret. She's got a lot to say, he observed. She has opinions, Clara said. She comes by it honestly. James Carter laughed a real laugh, the one she'd only heard a few times, the one that was the same laugh Nathaniel had underneath all the composure. She filed that away with everything else she'd been learning about the family. She was in her own deliberate way becoming part of. She told Nathaniel that evening. He was quiet when she finished. He set down his coffee. He looked at the table for a moment. He didn't tell me he was going to do that, he said. I know, she said. He did it on his own. Yes, she said. He looked up at her. Are you going to accept it? I'm going to have Reardon review it, she said. And then yes, I'm going to accept it. He nodded slowly. 100 acres, he said. 100 acres, she said. That's not a homestead, he said. That's a ranch. It could be, she said carefully. With the right help. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the thing that had been building between them since November, since the word he'd said that she'd told him was the right word, since the mortise and tenon cradle, and the tea tin, and the 1,000 small daily evidences of a man who had decided to be trustworthy and then simply kept being. All of that was in the room with them now, and neither of them pretended it wasn't. I have something to ask you, Nathaniel said. I know, she said. You know. I've known for 2 weeks, she said. I was waiting to see if you'd work up to it. He looked at her. You were waiting. I was also thinking about my answer, she said. Those aren't the same thing. And have you finished thinking? Yes, she said. Clara, he said. Will you? Yes, she said. He stopped. You didn't let me finish, he said. You were going to ask me to marry you, she said. I was. And I said yes, she said. Was there more? He looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, the real laugh, and she let her own smile come out all the way. For once the full version she'd been rationing for years, and it turned out the full version fit her face just fine. There were things I was going to say, he said. Say them anyway, she said. So he did. He said them plainly, without ornament, the way he said everything that mattered. He said he had never wanted a life more than he wanted the one they were building. He said he understood what she was offering was not herself as a possession, or a piece of anything, but herself as a person who had chosen him, and he did not take that lightly. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve being chosen. Clara listened to all of it. Then she said, The wedding will be simple. I don't want a production. Whatever you want, he said. And my name stays Whitfield. He looked at her. Our daughter is Margaret Whitfield, she said. I am Clara Whitfield. This land is filed under Whitfield. That name is what I built. I'm not giving it away. He was quiet a moment. Nathaniel Whitfield Carter, he said. Or Nathaniel Carter, husband of Clara Whitfield, she said. However you want to arrange it, but Whitfield stays. I thought about it for exactly as long as it needed to take. Nathaniel Carter, husband of Clara Whitfield, he said. That works? Good, she said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had reached for him first, and they both knew it, and she didn't make it complicated. "I'm glad you came back the second time," she said. "With the lumber." "I'm glad you let me in," he said. "You earned it," she said. "Remember that. You didn't just get it. You earned it." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know." They were married in May, in the yard of the cabin she'd built with the barn standing solid to the south and the spring grass coming in across the 100 acres and the creek running clear and full from the snowmelt. Eleanor Carter stood beside Clara. Reardon came from Billings. The timber-hauling boy who was 13 now and had been on this land the whole story of it, tied up the horses and stood in the back and looked like he understood he was witnessing something. The ceremony was simple as she'd required. The words were the necessary words and nothing more. When the minister asked Clara if she took this man, she said yes in the same voice she used for everything that mattered, levels certain chosen. When he asked Nathaniel looked at Clara and said yes with the full version of his expression, the one that had no management in it, and she received it fully for the first time openly, without the careful audit she'd been running since September. It was enough. It was more than enough. Afterwards, Eleanor found Clara by the east wall of the cabin, where Clara was standing with Margaret on her hip, looking at what the 100 acres looked like in May. "She's wonderful," Eleanor said. She meant Margaret, who was 5 months old and had opinions about the people at this gathering, having fixed her dark eyes on each face in turn with the particular assessment that was becoming her signature expression. "She is," Clara said. "She'll be a terror at 15, Eleanor said. "Good," Clara said. 15-year-olds should be difficult. It means they know their own minds. Eleanor laughed. Then she was quiet a moment, looking at the land. "I told Nathaniel to go," she said. "That day before Billings. I told him to tell the truth." I know," Clara said. "He told me." "I want you to know why," Eleanor said. She paused. "I have lived my whole life as a Carter. I came into it at 19, and I have been useful and steady and present, and I have done it well, and I don't regret it, not truly. But there are things I never did." She looked at Margaret. "I never told the truth in a room that was paying attention. I never built something with my own hands and stood in it." She looked at Clara. "My son was going to be the kind of man I needed him to be when I was 19, and I was not going to let James stop him." Clara looked at this woman who had spent 30 years being the capable, steady, invisible force that held a family together, and she thought about the different shapes that strength took, and how you could spend a whole life not recognizing the shape that wasn't yours as strength at all. "Thank you," Clara said. "For him." Eleanor nodded once. She was not a woman who needed more than that. The summer came in hard and full of work, the way Montana summers did everything needing to be done at once. The growing season short and unforgiving and enormously generous if you were paying attention. They planted the kitchen garden on the east side, where the soil ran deep, exactly where Clara had planned it in the winter. They finished the barn's interior. They brought in the first 3 cattle Carter stock purchased at fair price, because James had stopped giving things away for free, which was, Nathaniel said, the clearest sign that his father had actually changed, because James Carter giving things away was always James Carter making a statement about who owed whom. These were paid for. That mattered. Margaret grew the way children grew in that country, fast and opinionated. By 6 months, she was pulling herself upright on anything that would hold her. By 8 months, she was moving along the furniture with a focused, deliberate persistence that made Nathaniel say she was going to walk before she was supposed to, and Clara say she was going to walk exactly when she decided to, and not a moment before. She walked at 10 months. She went from the table leg to the cabin wall to the door frame to the yard, in 4 determined steps, fell down, got up, and did it again. Clara watched her daughter stand up in the yard of the home she'd built and take 4 steps across the ground she'd claimed, and she felt the thing she'd felt when the ridge beam went up, that almost overwhelming recognition of a thing made real that had only existed as intention before. She had built this. All of it. The walls and the roof and the floor and the 100 acres, and the partnership and the marriage, and the child who was currently taking her fourth and fifth and sixth steps across the spring ground, with the expression of someone who had identified a problem and was solving it. She had built every piece of it. Nathaniel came and stood beside her without being asked, the way he always came and stood beside her, and she leaned into him very slightly, not for support, just for proximity, and they watched their daughter negotiate the territory. "She's going to be all right," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Clara said. "She is." There was one more thing. It happened in September, a year to the month from the morning Nathaniel had ridden out with lumber that was not as they'd both known his father's surplus. A letter came from Harlan Creek, not from Edward, who had gone entirely quiet, and not from a lawyer, but from the county assessor's office. The letter informed Clara Whitfield Carter. The hyphen had been her compromise, a small one, and she'd offered it freely, that her homestead claim had been formally upgraded to a permanent land grant based on her documentation of continuous residence and cultivation, and that the adjacent parcel now recorded in her name brought the total holding to 104 acres of fee simple title. 104 acres. Hers. Clean. Clear. No motion, no counter-motion, no husband claiming what was never his to claim. She read the letter at the table she'd built, and set it down with the particular precision she used when something deserved to be placed carefully. Then she picked up Margaret, who was 11 months old, and had recently discovered she could express opinions by pointing at things with one decisive finger. And she walked to the door of her cabin, and she stood in the frame. She had hung herself, and she looked at the land that was hers and her daughter's, and the man who was her husband, who was out at the barn right now, who would come in for noon and hang his hat on the hook she'd put there for exactly that purpose. And she breathed. In this territory, in this year, in this particular life, she had built from almost nothing. Clara Whitfield had been told she could not survive. She had been told she was too weak and too alone and too foolish and too far gone with child. She had been told by a man who believed his money made him right, by a town that believed a woman's suffering was proof of her own bad choices, by a world that had arranged itself to make it easy to break and hard to build. She had built anyway. She had driven nails with bleeding hands and put up a ridge beam alone and stood in a courtroom with her voice level and her hands flat on the table and said, "I am not running. I am building." And she had been right, and she had proved it, not with words and not with anger and not with the kind of defiance that asks the world for permission, but with timber and glass and a legal filing and a photograph and the accumulated undeniable evidence of a life constructed deliberately, piece by piece, by a woman who understood that the only foundation worth building on was the one you'd laid yourself. She looked at her daughter on her hip, who was pointing at the barn with her decisive finger and making a sound that meant, "Go and see." "All right," Clara said. "Let's go see." She walked out across the yard of the home she had built, carrying the daughter she had protected toward the husband she had chosen on the land that was hers and no one else's and always would be. She did not look back at the cabin. She didn't need to. She knew it was standing. She had built it to stand, and it would stand long after she was gone, long after Margaret was grown, and the barn was old, and the kitchen garden had gone through 30 seasons of planting and harvesting, and the creek had changed its course by 6 inches, the way creeks did over time. It would stand because she had built it with the understanding that anything worth building was worth building to last, and she had never built anything she didn't intend to last. That was who she was. That was who she had always been underneath every year someone else spent trying to convince her otherwise. And in the mountains of Montana, on 104 acres of clear-titled land, beside a creek with confirmed water rights. Clara Whitfield had proved it not to the town, not to the judge, not to the husband who thought she couldn't survive without him, but to the only person whose proof had ever mattered. She had proved it to herself, and that was the only proof that ever built anything worth standing in.